Hello there and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm glad you're here tonight. Find somewhere comfortable, settle your shoulders, and let the noise around you fade a little. You might be listening from a bedroom, a quiet living room, a late shift at work, or a car parked beneath a streetlight. Wherever you are, take a moment to notice how safe the ordinary sounds around you feel. A refrigerator turning on, a vehicle passing outside, a neighbour closing a door. Sounds you recognise and understand, sounds that usually do not require you to make a decision. Tonight, we are going to Los Angeles. Not the Los Angeles of movie premieres, hillside mansions, beach photographs, and convertible cars moving beneath rows of palm trees. We're going several miles away from that familiar image, into neighbourhoods that appeared on television mostly when something had gone wrong. We're going to south central Los Angeles during the second half of the 1980s, when a cheap form of cocaine entered communities already dealing with unemployment, segregation, declining public investment, gang rivalries, and a difficult relationship with the police. The subject is crack cocaine, but this is not only a story about a drug. It is a story about what happens when a profitable illegal market appears in a place where legal opportunity has been disappearing. It is about young men discovering that a few hours on a street corner could produce more money than weeks of low-paid work, assuming that work was available at all. It is about families learning to recognise the difference between fireworks, a car backfiring, and gunshots. It is about police officers entering neighbourhoods where they were expected to control a crisis they had not created and could not solve through arrests alone. It is about residents trapped between armed dealers, rival gangs, aggressive policing, frightened politicians, and television cameras searching for the most alarming picture they could find. Before we begin, let me ask you something simple. What time is it where you are right now? Is your street still active or has it become quiet? If you heard several loud cracks outside your window, would you walk over and look through the curtains, or would you move away from the glass? For thousands of people living in parts of Los Angeles during these years, that was not a dramatic question. It was an ordinary calculation. If this kind of detailed history helps you slow down, think carefully, or understand a familiar event from a different angle, you can subscribe to the channel and give the video a like. There's no need to interrupt what you're doing. You can decide later, after we've spent some time on these streets together. You can also leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what you remember hearing about Los Angeles in the 1980s and early 1990s. Some people remember the news reports, some remember the fear, others remember living there and wondering why the reports showed the helicopters and police tape, but rarely showed the families trying to get through another week. Now, let us begin in the summer of 1984. Imagine that you are standing near a busy intersection in south central Los Angeles. The official boundaries of the area are debated, and the name itself will later become associated so strongly with poverty and violence that city leaders will prefer the term South Los Angeles. But in 1984, people commonly call it South Central, and the name covers a large collection of neighbourhoods rather than one uniform community. There are houses with trimmed lawns and families who have lived on the same block for years. There are apartment buildings where children move between open doors while adults talk on the steps. There are churches, small grocery stores, beauty salons, repair shops, schools, liquor stores, vacant lots, and streets lined with cars in different states of repair. Some residents own their homes. Some rent crowded rooms. Some leave early each morning for stable jobs in other parts of the city. Others have been looking for work for months. The neighbourhood is not waiting for a disaster. It is already living. A woman carries groceries from a bus stop because the nearest full supermarket is farther away than it should be. A mechanic works beneath the open hood of a car. Children ride bicycles along the sidewalk. Music comes through an apartment window. A man who worked for years in manufacturing wonders whether the factory will ever hire again. Teenagers gather near a convenience store, talking, joking, and watching the traffic. Then something new begins appearing more frequently. Small pale rocks are being sold in tiny quantities. They are cocaine, but they are not packaged or priced like the powdered cocaine associated with wealthy parties and expensive nightclubs. They can be smoked. Their effects arrive quickly, and individual doses can be sold for far less money than a gram of powder. Dealers do not need customers capable of spending $100 at once. They need many customers capable of finding $5, $10, or $20 repeatedly. That difference changes the market. Cocaine had existed in Los Angeles long before 1984, and smokable forms were not invented suddenly on one street corner. Investigators later found evidence of rock cocaine in South Central by the early 1980s, with police raids on so-called rock houses beginning around 1983. Major newspaper reporting started drawing attention to the expanding trade in 1984, by which point the market was already developing. At first, many people do not understand what they are seeing. Some police officers know that a new form of cocaine is circulating, but the scale of what follows is difficult to predict. Parents hear unfamiliar slang from their children. Residents notice strangers arriving on blocks where they have no apparent reason to be. Small groups gather briefly, exchange something and separate. Cars stop for less than a minute. Apartment windows become sales counters. Houses are taken over by people who sell throughout the day and into the night. The business is easy to enter compared with many other criminal markets. A seller does not need a large building, specialized machinery, or an advanced organization. A small amount of cocaine can be divided into many individual rocks. Each sale produces cash immediately. The customer may return soon because the intoxication is intense but short-lived. The dealer can stand near a walkway, an alley, a parking lot, or a bus stop and complete several transactions before anyone outside the neighborhood realizes a market exists. This does not mean that every teenager becomes a dealer or that every block becomes controlled by a gang. Most residents have nothing to do with the drug trade. Most young people are attending school, working, helping relatives, playing sports, listening to music, or trying to determine what adulthood will look like. Even among those involved in gangs, participation in drug selling varies widely. That distinction matters because the history is often compressed into a simple sentence. Crack arrived, gang sold it, and the killing began. The reality was less orderly. A major study of Los Angeles cocaine sales found that arrests connected to rock cocaine rose dramatically between 1983 and 1985, increasing by 375%. Yet the early explosion in selling was not initially dominated by street gangs, and researchers did not find a simple, immediate connection in which gang involvement automatically produced violence in every transaction. Independent dealers, small crews, relatives, acquaintances, and existing drug sellers all participated. Gang members entered the trade, but crack did not arrive under the control of one central organization with a clear plan. That lack of central control made the streets more unpredictable. Picture a business district with no courts, no written contracts, no insurance, and no legal method for settling disputes. A seller cannot call the police because another seller has taken his product. He cannot file a lawsuit because a supplier has failed to deliver. He cannot report an employee for stealing cash. Every agreement depends on reputation, personal loyalty, fear, or force. When the profits are small, arguments may remain small. When hundreds or thousands of dollars begin passing through a few yards of sidewalk, every disagreement carries more weight. A customer claims that a rock is too small. A seller believes someone is operating on the wrong corner. Money disappears from an apartment. A package is taken. A runner fails to return. A rumor spreads that one group plans to move into another group's territory. Someone insults someone else in front of friends. An old gang dispute becomes attached to a new source of money. A personal argument is interpreted as a challenge to an entire neighborhood. The firearm becomes the final authority because the market offers no other one. Guns were already present in Los Angeles before crack, just as gangs were already present. The Bloods and Crips had history stretching back to the late 1960s and early 1970s. Their rivalries developed from local conflicts, neighbourhood identity, youth organisations, policing, and the social conditions of the city. Crack did not create those divisions. What it could do was place cash, customers, and contested selling locations inside them. It also gave some young people the ability to purchase more powerful weapons. A teenager who might once have carried a small handgun for status or protection could now have enough cash to buy multiple weapons. Sellers became attractive robbery targets, so they armed themselves. Rivals assumed they were armed and carried guns in response. Customers brought guns. People guarding drug houses brought guns. Residents who had no role in the trade sometimes bought firearms because they feared everyone else carrying them. The result was not a carefully organised war between two unified armies. The Bloods were not one army, and the Crips were not another. Both names covered many individual sets, each rooted in a specific area, with their own alliances, enemies, personalities, and internal conflicts. Two groups carrying the same broad identity might cooperate in one situation and fight in another. Violence could involve drug territory, but it could also involve older rivalries, retaliation, reputation, personal disputes, or a shooting whose original cause became irrelevant after the first funeral. Researchers studying Los Angeles homicides would later warn against assuming that most gang killings were simply battles over narcotics. An analysis of homicides from 1986 through part of 1988 found that gang-motivated killings were often separate from narcotics-motivated killings. Drugs, gangs, and violence overlapped, but they did not form one single explanation. People living in the neighbourhoods did not need an academic study to know that distinction. They knew that a young man could be shot because he sold drugs, because someone believed he sold drugs, because he lived on the wrong block, because he wore the wrong colour, because he resembled someone else, or because he was standing beside the intended target. They also knew that innocent did not mean protected. Imagine a mother calling her children inside before sunset even though the weather is warm. The children complain because their friends are still outdoors. She does not explain everything she has heard. She simply tells them to come in. Imagine a teenager deciding which streets to avoid on the walk home from school. The direct route passes through an area associated with another gang. The safer route adds 20 minutes, but safety is never guaranteed because boundaries can change, and people do not always agree on where one territory ends and another begins. Imagine lying on the floor when shots are fired nearby. Not because you have been hit, but because someone in the family has learned that bullets can pass through walls. You stay low until the sound stops. Then nobody moves for several seconds because silence does not prove the danger is over. Afterward, the adults check the children. Someone looks outside without standing directly in the window. A car speeds away. A dog barks. Doors open cautiously. Neighbours call to one another. Someone has been hurt, or perhaps nobody has. The police may arrive quickly, or they may arrive after the people responsible are gone. The next morning, everyone still has somewhere to be. This is one of the most important things to understand about a neighbourhood experiencing repeated violence. Most of the day can look normal. People go to work, buses run, teachers take attendance, couples argue about bills, children ask what is for dinner, someone washes a car, someone celebrates a birthday, someone studies for an exam while a police helicopter moves overhead. A place does not stop being a community because violence is occurring inside it. Yet repeated danger changes behaviour in ways that are difficult to see from outside. Families stop sitting on porches, businesses close earlier, witnesses become reluctant to speak because cooperation with police can bring retaliation, and because trust in the police is already weak. Children learn which sounds require them to drop to the ground. Ambulance crews become familiar with intersections they would rather not know so well. Hospital emergency rooms treat young men whose injuries would normally be associated with military combat. even though the patients were shot only a few miles from downtown Los Angeles. Television news begins collecting the most frightening images: yellow tape, bodies covered near sidewalks, young men in handcuffs, graffiti, weapons arranged on tables after police raids. Reporters describe neighborhoods as if every resident is either a criminal or a potential victim waiting helplessly for rescue. The phrase war zone becomes common. For viewers elsewhere, the phrase makes the crisis easy to understand. A war zone has enemies, soldiers, battle lines, and a clear objective. But South Central Los Angeles has none of that clarity. The person selling drugs may live with a grandmother who despises the trade but depends on his money for rent. The police officer making an arrest may believe he is removing a dangerous gunman, while the residents watching may see another young man being thrown against a wall without cause. A gang member may be feared on one block and loved on another. A child may have an uncle in prison, a cousin selling crack, a teacher trying to help, and a police officer pointing a weapon during a raid, all within the same month. There are no clean sides. By 1987 and 1988, the market is larger, the weapons are more dangerous, and the political pressure is rising. Residents demand protection from shootings and drug sales. Civil rights advocates warn that broad police sweeps will treat entire neighborhoods as criminal populations. Police leaders argue that ordinary enforcement methods are inadequate. City officials want visible action. Newspapers want results. Television audiences want to know why Los Angeles appears unable to control its streets. The Los Angeles Police Department prepares a response built around mass deployment, gang intelligence, street stops, raids, and arrests. Officers will flood selected neighborhoods. Young men will be ordered against walls or onto the ground. Houses will be entered by heavily armed teams. Thousands of people will be detained or arrested during campaigns intended to restore order. The best known of those campaigns will be called Operation Hammer. The name tells you how the department understands the task. A hammer is not designed to diagnose a problem. It is designed to strike. For some residents, the increased police presence will bring temporary relief from open drug sales. For others, it will make daily life feel like an occupation. People who ask the city for safety will discover that the city's answer may include being stopped while walking home, questioned because of clothing or location, and treated as a possible gang member before being treated as a resident. The police will say they are entering a battlefield. Many residents will say the police have helped turn their neighborhood into one. Neither statement explains how Los Angeles reached this point. To understand that, we have to move backward, before the small rocks, before the crowded drug houses, before the drive-by shootings became a regular feature of the evening news. We have to look at the factories that closed, the jobs that moved, the housing boundaries that separated communities, the schools asked to manage more with less, and the long history that shaped relations between black residents and the LAPD. Crack entered South Central Los Angeles quickly, but it did not enter an empty space. It entered a place carrying decades of unfinished history. To understand why crack caused so much damage in South Central Los Angeles, we have to begin before crack was widely sold there. We have to look at a neighborhood that had already spent decades absorbing decisions made by banks, employers, developers, highway planners, police officials, school administrators, and politicians. By the early 1980s, many residents were living inside the results of those decisions without having had much power over them. The houses were still there. The churches were still open. Families still held birthday parties, washed cars on weekends, attended school performances, and watched one another's children. People worked as nurses, mechanics, teachers, postal employees, bus drivers, clerks, construction workers, factory hands, cooks, and domestic workers. South Central was not an abandoned territory, and it was not naturally poor. It contained stable neighborhoods, commercial streets, skilled workers, homeowners, renters, recent arrivals, and families whose roots in Los Angeles went back several generations. Yet the pressure was becoming harder to ignore. Imagine driving through the area in 1980. You pass rows of small houses built close together, many with narrow lawns and driveways leading to detached garages. Some blocks are carefully maintained. On others, paint is peeling from apartment buildings whose owners live somewhere else. There are auto shops, furniture stores, markets, check-cashing businesses, churches and liquor stores. You see buses crowded with workers travelling toward jobs in other parts of the city. You also see empty industrial buildings, fenced lots, and properties waiting for investment that rarely arrives. Nothing in this scene tells you that a drug crisis is coming. What it tells you is that the neighbourhood is already losing some of the institutions that once made economic stability possible. During and after the Second World War, Los Angeles became one of the most important industrial regions in the United States. Aircraft production, automobile assembly, tyre manufacturing, steel, metalworking, shipping, construction, food processing, and defence-related industries created large numbers of jobs. These were not always easy or well-paid positions, and discrimination remained common, but they gave many workers without university degrees a route into the middle class. Black migration to Los Angeles increased during the war years as families left the South searching for defence work and relief from Jim Crow segregation. They arrived in a city that promoted itself as modern, open, and different from the older racial order of the South. The promise was only partly true. Los Angeles did not usually separate people through signs reading white and coloured. Instead, segregation operated through property agreements, lending practices, real estate customs, intimidation, zoning, and unequal access to public and private investment. Black families were frequently restricted to particular districts, even when they could afford homes elsewhere. Banks and federal housing programs treated racially mixed or black neighbourhoods as risky investments. White homeowners were warned that integration would reduce property values. Real estate agents steered buyers toward or away from certain areas. The result was a city that could claim to have no formal colour line while maintaining one through the housing market. South Central became one of the few large areas where black families could purchase or rent homes. That concentration helped create strong communities, businesses, churches, newspapers, civic organisations and political networks. It also meant that overcrowding and housing demand increased because black residents could not move freely into many surrounding districts. When legal barriers began to fall, the pattern did not disappear overnight. Some black families with enough income moved toward areas such as West Adams, Limert Park, Baldwin Hills, and eventually suburban communities farther from the centre of the city. White residents left many neighbourhoods as racial boundaries shifted. Businesses and investment often followed the departing population. The process was not as simple as one group replacing another. It involved lending decisions, freeway construction, school boundaries, changing industries, property speculation, and fear deliberately encouraged by parts of the real estate business. The neighbourhood remained full of people, but money moved out more easily than people could. That difference matters. A family can live on a block for 30 years and still have little control over whether a bank finances local businesses, whether a supermarket opens nearby, whether a factory remains in operation, or whether landlords repair apartment buildings. A church can provide food and counselling, but it cannot replace thousands of industrial jobs. A teacher can keep students focused for several hours, but cannot guarantee that their parents will find work after a plant closes. By the 1970s, Los Angeles industry was changing. Some factories automated, some relocated to suburbs, other states, or other countries. Defence spending rose and fell according to federal policy. Manufacturing employers increasingly sought cheaper land and labour outside the central city. The same economy that had attracted workers during the war was no longer offering the same number of stable positions to their children. This decline did not happen in a single year. There was no morning when the residents of South Central woke up and discovered that industrial Los Angeles had vanished. It happened through announcements, layoffs, reduced shifts, hiring freezes, and plants that remained technically open while employing fewer people. A father who had expected his son to enter the same workplace could no longer make that promise. A mother working two low-paid jobs found that neither offered the benefits once provided by a unionised factory position. Young people graduated from high school and discovered that the local path from adolescence into steady employment had narrowed. The buildings left behind were visible reminders. A closed factory is not only a lost employer, it is also fewer customers at nearby restaurants, fewer workers buying gasoline, fewer families able to maintain houses, fewer tax dollars, and less money circulating through neighbourhood stores. Each lost paycheck affects landlords, barbers, mechanics, grocers, and relatives. Economic decline travels through a community in small transactions. At the same time, the wider Los Angeles economy was growing. Entertainment, finance, technology, international trade, property development, and professional services created wealth. New office towers rose, expensive neighbourhoods expanded. The city was not becoming poor. Opportunity was moving into sectors that often required education, connections, transportation, or geographic mobility that many residents of South Central did not possess. A teenager could see prosperity on television and encounter it while travelling to another part of the city. He might clean an office building whose employees earned more in a week than his household earned in a month. He might pass luxury cars on the freeway and return to a neighbourhood where the youth unemployment rate was severe. The problem was not that young people did not know wealth existed. They could see it clearly. They could also see the distance between themselves and the legal routes toward it. None of this made crime inevitable. Most people facing unemployment did not join gangs, sell drugs, or carry guns. Families developed ways to survive. Relatives pooled money. People repaired cars in driveways, watched children for neighbours, sold food, worked temporary jobs, and travelled long distances for employment. Churches and local organisations provided assistance. Homeowners protected what they had built. Parents set rules and demanded that children remain in school. But economic stress placed limits on what those efforts could achieve. A household can absorb one missed paycheck. It may survive several months of unstable work. Years of limited opportunity are different. They affect relationships, health, school performance, housing conditions, and the authority adults have when advising young people. Consider what it means for a father to tell his son that discipline and hard work will lead to success, when the father himself has been laid off despite years of discipline and hard work. The advice may still be correct. The son may still respect him. Yet both of them can see that the promise has become less reliable. This loss of certainty created space for other forms of authority. Street gangs had existed in Black Los Angeles long before the crack era. Researchers have traced black neighbourhood groups back to at least the 1930s, while larger and more conflict-oriented gangs developed after the Second World War, particularly in and around public housing projects in Watts. Racism, territorial conflict, housing concentration, and the social conditions of the projects all contributed to their formation. The early groups were not identical to the gangs that later appeared on national television. Some functioned partly as social clubs, groups of friends, car clubs, party organisations, or neighbourhood defence associations. They fought, committed crimes, and defended territory, but they also grew from the ordinary desire of young people to belong to something. That desire became more powerful when other forms of belonging seemed unavailable. In the 1960s, political organisations provided an alternative source of identity for some young black residents. Civil rights groups, black nationalist organisations, community programs, and the Black Panther Party offered political education and collective purpose. They spoke about police brutality, housing, employment, schools, and racial power. Some operated breakfast programs, health initiatives, and neighbourhood patrols. Law enforcement agencies treated several of these organisations as serious threats. Police raids, arrests, surveillance, internal conflict, and federal counterintelligence operations weakened them. This did not mean that gangs simply replaced political organisations in a direct sequence. History rarely works so neatly. It did mean that by the early 1970s, some of the strongest neighbourhood institutions capable of channeling youthful anger into political action had been damaged or removed. The gangs that expanded in the same period offered a different type of structure. The Crips emerged around 1969 and spread rapidly through South Los Angeles. The exact story of the name and early organisation varies depending on who tells it, but Raymond Washington is generally identified as one of the central founding figures. Other neighbourhood groups formed alliances for protection against expanding Crip sets. Some of those groups, including the Pierce and Brims, became associated with the blood identity. These names can create the false impression that two coordinated organisations controlled the city. They did not. The Crips consisted of separate neighbourhood sets. So did the Bloods. The larger identities created alliances and enemies, but local loyalty usually mattered most. A young man did not simply join the Crips. He joined or grew up around a particular set associated with several blocks, a housing project, a school, or a neighbourhood. That set might fight a nearby blood group, another Crip set, or both. Territory became personal because it was tied to identity. A street sign, school, housing project, or local park could represent belonging. Crossing into another area could be interpreted as a challenge. Young people learned boundaries that adults might not even recognise. A person walking a few blocks could pass from one claimed territory into another without seeing a physical marker. This danger existed before crack. Los Angeles County authorities were already reporting a serious rise in gang violence during the 1970s. The county created specialised prosecution programs before the crack market became dominant. One official account noted that reported gang-related homicides rose from 168 in 1977 to 351 in 1980. The figures reflected both the seriousness of the violence and the growing institutional focus on categorising crimes as gang-related. Researchers examining violent incidents from 1978 to 1982 found that gang cases were more likely than other violent cases to occur in public places, involve young male participants, include cars and firearms, produce multiple victims or injuries, and feature unknown suspects. Fear of retaliation also complicated investigations. In other words, many of the patterns later associated with the crack years were already present. Young men were already shooting from cars, witnesses were already afraid to cooperate, rivalries were already producing funerals, police and prosecutors were already creating specialised gang units, families were already losing children to conflicts that could continue for years after the original cause had been forgotten. Crack did not invent the structure. It gave the structure a new source of money. The relationship between residents and the Los Angeles Police Department was another pressure that had developed over decades. The LAPD had built a national reputation for professionalism, efficiency, and centralised command. Under Chief William H. Parker, who led the department from 1950 until 1966, the force presented itself as a disciplined barrier between order and criminal disorder. The model valued independence from political interference and emphasised rapid deployment, patrol and strong officer authority. Many white residents admired it. Many black and Mexican American residents experienced something different. They described frequent stops, insults, physical force, and treatment based on race and neighbourhood. Police officers often entered communities as outsiders, with limited personal connection to the people they patrolled. The department's professional distance, celebrated by its supporters, could feel like hostility to residents who encountered officers mainly during stops, searches, arrests, and raids. The conflict became impossible to ignore in August 1965. A traffic stop involving a young black driver in Watts drew a crowd. The confrontation expanded over several days into widespread unrest, looting, fires, police actions, and deployment of the California National Guard. 34 people died, more than 1,000 were injured and thousands were arrested. The official investigation that followed identified unemployment, poor housing, inadequate schools, and strained police relations as major sources of anger. Yet many recommendations were only partly implemented, delayed, or forgotten once the immediate emergency passed. The LAPD created a Community Relations Bureau after the uprising, acknowledging that police community tensions were contributing to unrest. The department itself describes the unit as having been founded in 1965 to address these problems and build public trust. Creating a bureau was easier than changing daily experience. For residents, trust depended on what happened during an encounter on the sidewalk. It depended on whether an officer listened, whether a person was searched without explanation, whether a complaint was taken seriously, and whether police appeared equally concerned when the victim came from South Central. For officers, the neighbourhood could seem hostile and dangerous. Gang violence, firearms, attacks on police, and reluctant witnesses encouraged suspicion. Officers learned to approach groups of young men as possible threats. Residents saw that suspicion and responded with anger, silence, or resistance. Each side interpreted the reaction of the other as proof that its original suspicion was justified. This cycle was already well established before the crack trade expanded. The police helicopter became one of its most recognisable symbols. The LAPD began using helicopters in the 1950s and greatly expanded its air support division during the 1970s. Aircraft that had initially been used mainly for traffic enforcement became part of emergency response and crime patrol. From the department's perspective, helicopters allowed officers to follow suspects, coordinate ground units, and watch large areas efficiently. From the ground, the experience was different. A helicopter could circle above a block for long periods, shining a light across roofs, windows, and yards. Its sound entered every house beneath it. Children woke up. Conversations stopped. Residents stepped outside to see what had happened and were ordered back indoors through a loudspeaker. Even when the aircraft was searching for one person, everyone below felt included in the operation. The helicopter made policing impossible to ignore. So did the growth of specialised units. Metropolitan Division expanded significantly in 1968, increasing from roughly 70 officers to around 200. It provided the department with a heavily trained reserve force capable of using specialised tactics and equipment. This capacity would later support large-scale sweeps and raids. Long before Operation Hammer, however, it helped shape a policing culture that believed concentrated force could restore control to troubled areas. Residents often held two opinions at the same time. They wanted the police to stop shootings, protect children, close drug houses, and respond quickly when someone called for help. They also feared what the police might do when they arrived. These positions were not contradictory. A person could oppose gang violence and police brutality. A mother could demand more protection while warning her son never to argue with an officer. A shopkeeper could report a robbery and still distrust the detectives who came to investigate it. The neighbourhood was not choosing between crime and policing as abstract ideas. It was dealing with both as daily realities. Schools carried another part of the burden. Teachers worked with students who arrived tired, hungry, frightened, or distracted by events at home. Counsellors managed problems that extended far beyond academic performance. Campuses became places where neighbourhood rivalries could meet. A disagreement beginning near lockers might continue after school and draw in people who did not attend the school at all. Administrators adopted rules against colours, clothing, and symbols associated with gangs. Security increased. Students were searched or questioned. Some young people welcomed the protection. Others felt that schools had begun treating them as suspects. At the same time, California's public finances changed. The passage of Proposition 13 in 1978 sharply limited property taxes and altered local government funding. The effects were complicated and varied across districts, but schools and public services faced new financial constraints at the same moment that urban communities required greater support. After-school programs, recreation centres, sports, job training, counselling and youth outreach were not simply optional activities in this environment. They provided supervised spaces, adult relationships, and reasons for young people from rival neighbourhoods to interact without fighting. When those programs were limited, the street gained more time. A teenager leaving school might return to an apartment where adults were still at work. The park might belong to a particular gang. The recreation centre might close early or lack staff. A local business might refuse to hire someone from the neighbourhood. The young people already standing on the corner offered company, protection, status, and an identity. Joining them did not require an application or a resume. This is why explanations based only on individual choices are incomplete. Every person still made choices. Many young people rejected gangs despite facing the same pressures. Some joined and later left. Some moved between gang life, school, work, family responsibilities, and periods of incarceration. But choices are made inside conditions. By the beginning of the 1980s, South Central contained a large population of young people, limited employment opportunities, established territorial gangs, widespread distrust of police, underfunded institutions, and easy access to firearms. Gang violence had already become serious enough to produce specialised police and prosecution programs. The neighbourhood was under pressure, but it had not collapsed. Residents still organised peace efforts. Community workers entered dangerous areas to mediate disputes. Churches held meetings. Parents formed patrols and support groups. Coaches kept gyms open. Teachers used their own money for supplies. Former gang members tried to persuade younger people not to repeat their mistakes. Even official anti-gang projects sometimes recognized that suppression alone was not enough. A California program operating in the late 1970s hired gang leaders as consultants, created forums for resolving conflicts, organized recreation, and helped negotiate peace agreements. Its evaluation reported reductions in some forms of gang homicide during its first year, although overall violent incidents remained a problem. That effort showed that rivalries were not beyond human control. People could negotiate. Violence could decline. Young men identified as gang members could participate in preventing killings when given a reason and a structure to do so. Programs like that required patience, funding, trust, and people willing to work without immediate results. Police sweeps produced faster pictures for television. By 1982 and 1983, a resident looking across South Central would have seen a community carrying many risks, but also many forms of resistance. The future was not decided. Gang violence might have been reduced through employment, intervention, education, and sustained local investment. Police relations might have improved through accountability and long-term cooperation. Closed industrial sites might have been replaced by new opportunities. Instead, another economy was about to expand. It did not require a factory. It did not ask for a diploma. It did not care about a criminal record, an address, or previous work experience. It offered immediate cash in neighbourhoods where legal employers had withdrawn. It operated during the day and night. It could employ a seller, lookout, runner, guard, supplier, driver, or person willing to provide an apartment. Most importantly, it converted existing disadvantages into business advantages. A vacant building became a sales location. An unemployed teenager became available labour. A gang boundary became a protected market. Distrust of police discouraged witnesses. Firearms enforced agreements. Poverty created customers and sellers. The city's separation made it possible for people outside the neighbourhood to ignore the consequences until the violence became impossible to contain. The first pieces of crack cocaine did not create these conditions. They arrived among them. By 1983, people working narcotics cases in South Central Los Angeles were beginning to encounter a substance that did not fit the older cocaine market. Cocaine itself was not new. Powder cocaine had circulated through Los Angeles for years, but it was expensive enough to remain closely associated with customers who had money. It appeared at private parties, in entertainment circles, in clubs, and among professionals who could afford to purchase it by the gram. For many people living in South Central, cocaine was visible as part of another Los Angeles, not as something sold openly outside the neighborhood market. The new product changed that calculation. It was cocaine processed into a solid, smokable form and divided into small pieces. People called those pieces rocks. The name was simple because the product was simple to recognize. A buyer did not need to understand chemistry or know a well-connected supplier. The substance could be placed in a glass pipe, heated and inhaled. The effect reached the brain quickly, producing an intense rush that faded much sooner than the effects associated with slower methods of taking cocaine. That short duration mattered almost as much as the low price. A person could purchase one small rock, smoke it, and feel an immediate effect. When that effect disappeared, the desire to repeat it could appear quickly. The customer did not have to save enough money to buy a large quantity. The seller did not have to wait for a wealthy client. The transaction could happen with whatever money the customer had available at that moment. $5, $10, $20. Early prices varied by year, location, size, and dealer. A 1984 Los Angeles Times report described rocks being sold for around $25 in South Central, while the market later became known for smaller units that could be purchased for $5 or $10. What mattered was not one permanent price. What mattered was that cocaine could now be broken into affordable retail portions and sold to a much larger number of people. Justice Department investigators later concluded that rock cocaine was appearing more frequently in South Central by 1982, that police raids on rock houses began in 1983, and that the crisis became publicly visible around 1984. The $5 rock would become the most powerful symbol of the market because $5 did not sound like the price of a life-changing decision. It sounded like spare money. A customer might spend $5 out of curiosity. Another might purchase a rock after seeing friends use it. Someone already using powder cocaine could discover that smoking the drug produced a faster and stronger sensation. A person trying to stay awake, forget a problem, or escape a difficult evening might believe that one purchase was manageable. Many people tried crack without becoming regular users. Others used it occasionally. Some became trapped in repeated cycles of use, searching for money and returning to the seller several times in one day. The drug did not control every person in exactly the same way, and the most frightening descriptions in later media coverage often treated users as if they lost all judgment immediately. Real behaviour was more varied. Still, the market had discovered a product unusually well suited to repeated street sales. Picture a customer approaching a house in the afternoon. The building looks ordinary from the outside. Curtains cover the windows. Several people stand nearby without appearing to do anything. One watches the street. Another waits near a side entrance. The customer gives money to one person and receives a small rock from another. The exchange takes seconds. The customer leaves, but the house remains open for business. Another buyer arrives, then another. The structure could be as informal as one person selling from an apartment, or as organised as a fortified rock house with lookouts, coded pager messages, transportation systems, and several workers. Contemporary researchers describe dealers operating multiple houses and using coordinated methods to protect the locations and move product. Those houses represented a new form of distribution because they could serve a continuous stream of buyers while separating the supplier, seller, money and drugs across several people. The word house may make the operation sound permanent and controlled. Many were neither. Some locations opened for a short period and closed when police attention increased. Dealers moved between apartments, motel rooms, abandoned buildings, garages and private homes. A tenant might allow sales in exchange for drugs or money. A homeowner could lose control of a property after a relative or partner became involved. residents sometimes found that an apartment nearby had changed from a quiet home into a place receiving visitors throughout the night. The traffic altered the block. Cars stopped and started. Buyers walked through yards. Arguments took place near windows. People smoked in alleys or abandoned buildings. Stolen property began appearing because customers without cash could exchange goods for drugs or sell them to raise money. Radios, televisions, tools, jewellery, clothing and household objects moved through a small underground economy centred on the next purchase. This was one way crack affected residents who never used it. A person did not need to smoke crack to lose a bicycle from a yard, have a car window broken, or discover that a family member had sold something from the house. A landlord did not need to sell drugs to find an apartment damaged by constant traffic. A child did not need to understand addiction to recognise that an adult's behaviour had become unpredictable. The economics of the trade were visible to young people almost immediately. Suppose a teenager had $100. In the legal economy, that amount might pay for shoes, groceries, or part of the rent. In the crack economy, it could purchase a quantity of product, divide it into smaller units, and return $200 if every piece sold. The profits were not always as reliable as dealers claimed. Product could be stolen, police could seize it, customers could refuse to pay, a supplier could cheat a new seller, violence could end the business before the first day was over. But the promise was easy to understand. $100 could become $200. Ricky Donnell Ross, who became one of the best-known cocaine traffickers in Los Angeles, later described the system as a double-up. A person could invest a small amount, sell the product in smaller portions, and return with twice the money. Ross built a large network and supplied many sellers, but federal investigators found that he neither invented crack nor single-handedly caused its spread. By the time his organisation reached its peak in the middle of the decade, rock cocaine was already widely available, and numerous dealers were competing for the market. That point matters because stories about historical crises often search for one person who started everything. One dealer is easier to understand than a market. One supplier is easier to blame than hundreds of decisions made by producers, wholesalers, street sellers, customers, landlords, police officers, and public officials. Ross was important, and his network distributed large amounts of cocaine. He was not the only source, and there was no single moment when one man introduced crack to an unsuspecting neighbourhood. Several forms of smokable cocaine had been developing in different places. Freebasing was known on the West Coast during the 1970s. Coca paste and cocaine-based smoking had appeared in South America and the Caribbean. The Drug Enforcement Administration later reported identifying crack in Los Angeles, Houston, Miami, and San Diego in 1981. Researchers and investigators have disagreed about where the modern form first appeared, making any claim of a single inventor unreliable. South Central did not need an inventor. It needed supply, demand, and a method of selling the product cheaply. All three were present. Cocaine was entering the United States in increasing quantities. A seller who acquired powder could convert it into rocks using a relatively uncomplicated process. Larger amounts could be divided repeatedly until one wholesale purchase supported many street transactions. Because each retail unit was small, a customer did not have to know the main dealer. Most buyers interacted only with the person standing closest to the street. This protected the people higher in the chain. A supplier sold kilograms or ounces to mid-level dealers. Those dealers distributed smaller amounts to people running houses or street locations. The final seller might carry only enough product for a limited number of transactions. If police arrested that person, the supplier remained distant. Another seller could take the corner later. The market did not depend on one irreplaceable worker. It depended on a large number of people who needed money. A lookout could be paid to watch for police cars. A runner could carry drugs between locations. Someone could hold the money while another person held the product, making it harder for police to prove who had completed the sale. A driver could deliver packages. A resident could rent a room. A teenager too young to find stable employment could perform a simple task and receive more cash than a legal job might pay in several days. The work appeared flexible. It did not require formal training. It did not check references. It did not reject a person for lacking experience. It also offered status. A successful seller could purchase clothing, jewellery, cars, sound systems, and expensive shoes. He could give money to relatives, pay bills, and appear generous. In a neighbourhood where many adults were struggling to find work, the dealer could look like the person who had solved the economic problem. The image was often misleading. Much of the visible money belonged to suppliers or had to be used to purchase more product. Sellers were robbed, cars were rented or borrowed, jewellery was lost, arrest interrupted earnings, legal expenses accumulated, friends expected gifts, relatives needed help. A person who appeared wealthy on Saturday could have nothing left by Monday. Street-level dealing also carried a high risk of injury, imprisonment, and death. Those costs were not visible in the first handful of cash. The expansion did not initially belong entirely to the Bloods and Crips. A study using Los Angeles law enforcement records found that cocaine sales arrests increased by 375% between 1983 and 1985. Gang member participation rose during the expansion, but the researchers concluded that ordinary drug dealers, rather than gangs as organisations, controlled much of the early crack trade. They also found inconsistent evidence that gang involvement itself produced the first increase in violence surrounding distribution. That finding challenges one of the most persistent images of the period. The popular version shows organised Blood and Crip armies deciding to enter the cocaine business, assigning territory and beginning a coordinated war. In reality, some gang members sold crack, some did not, and many independent sellers participated. A person could belong to a gang and sell drugs without the entire set controlling the operation. Another could sell independently, while relying on neighbourhood connections for protection. Over time, the money changed those relationships. A profitable corner needed to be defended. A rock house required protection from robbery. Sellers wanted warning when police approached. A dealer operating in a gang-controlled neighbourhood often had to negotiate with local members, employ them, share profits, or accept their authority. Gang identity could provide workers, customers, information, and armed protection. It could also create enemies. The same corner now carried two meanings. It was part of a neighbourhood's identity, and it was a source of income. An insult over territory was no longer only about respect. It could threaten daily profits. A shooting could remove a competitor. A robbery could supply enough product to start a rival operation. Retaliation could protect a reputation that was essential to conducting illegal business. Even then, not every shooting was a drug shooting. Researchers studying Los Angeles repeatedly found that gang violence, drug violence, and personal violence overlapped without becoming identical. A dispute might begin with money and continue as a gang conflict. Another might begin with a gang rivalry and later involve dealers. By the time several people had been killed, the original cause could become impossible to separate from the retaliation. Residents experienced the expansion before many officials understood its scale. They saw people who had previously used other drugs begin appearing around rock houses. They saw cars arrive from outside the neighbourhood. They saw young sellers holding thick rolls of cash. They heard arguments at hours when the block had once been quiet. Small businesses noticed the change. Customers avoided stores near active sales locations. Owners dealt with people entering bathrooms to smoke. Employees were threatened or robbed. Parking lots became meeting places. Some business owners installed bars, stronger locks, brighter lights, and thick protective glass. Those changes created a visual language that later came to define South Central on television. Metal bars covered windows. Security doors replaced screen doors. Store clerks worked behind transparent partitions. Signs warned that little cash was kept inside. Residents placed fences around yards that had once been open. Apartment managers locked entrances. Each measure made sense by itself. Together, they made the neighbourhood look imprisoned. families developed rules that children followed without always understanding the reason. Do not pick up small plastic bags from the ground. Do not walk near the abandoned building. Do not answer the door for strangers. Do not tell anyone where your mother keeps money. Come inside when the street begins filling with unfamiliar cars. Adults also learned the signs of a sale, the brief hand movement, the customer waiting near a telephone booth, the person watching the intersection without speaking to anyone, the car that circled twice before stopping, the apartment window that opened for a few seconds and closed again. These patterns became ordinary through repetition. The medical consequences were becoming visible as well. Los Angeles County data from 1981 through 1987 showed cocaine becoming the region's fastest growing drug problem. Cocaine-related deaths, emergency room cases, and treatment admissions all increased, with particularly large increases between 1985 and 1986. Cocaine moved above heroin in drug-related deaths and emergency room admissions by 1984. Emergency room workers saw patients experiencing chest pain, seizures, severe agitation, paranoia, and injuries connected to the drug market. Treatment programs built around heroin or alcohol were not always prepared for people using crack. There was no medication equivalent to methadone that could stabilize cocaine dependence. Many users entered treatment under pressure from relatives, courts, or medical emergencies and then returned to the same streets where the product remained available. The short cycle of crack use changed family finances quickly. A person using powder cocaine occasionally might spend a large amount during one night. A person repeatedly purchasing small rocks could spend money throughout the day. The individual transactions looked minor, but the total became serious. Rent money disappeared in $5 and $10 purchases. Food money lasted for hours rather than days. The effect spread through relatives. A grandmother cared for children because their parent was using. A sister hid her purse inside her own home. A husband searched for his wife near a rock house. A mother allowed an adult son to return after promising that he had stopped, then discovered household property missing again. Families often moved between anger and rescue. They changed locks, paid debts, refused money, offered treatment, called police, withdrew complaints, took custody of children, and tried once more. There was no universal response because every household faced a different combination of addiction, love, fear, and limited resources. Public discussion did not always reflect that complexity. The language surrounding crack grew harsher as the market expanded. Users were described as lost, irrational, or beyond help. Mothers who used crack became symbols of moral failure. Young sellers became predators. Neighborhoods were described as infected. The language encouraged emergency action, but it also removed people from the story. A person with an addiction became a crackhead. A teenager selling on a corner became a gang member even when police had not established that he belonged to a gang. A woman exchanging sex for money or drugs became evidence of neighborhood collapse rather than someone facing addiction, exploitation, and danger. Once the labels were applied, harsh treatment became easier to justify. The public was told that crack was entirely different from powder cocaine. Chemically, the active drug was still cocaine. The methods of use, speed of effect, patterns of sale and social setting differed, but the substances were pharmacologically close. Later federal policy would punish crack offences far more severely than powder cocaine offences, creating a disparity that fell heavily on black defendants. Even federal drug policy officials would eventually acknowledge that the sentencing difference could not be justified by the pharmacological distinctions alone. In the middle of the 1980s, however, those distinctions had not yet become a national legal structure. On the street, the immediate concern was the market's speed. A product could arrive, be divided, and sell out within hours. Cash moved upward through the chain. More cocaine returned. New sellers appeared because they saw the money. More customers tried the drug because it was available. The number of sales increased faster than police could eliminate locations. Closing one rock house did not remove demand. Arresting one seller did not remove supply. The basic retail unit remained small enough for a new customer to enter, and profitable enough for a new seller to take the risk. That combination was what changed everything. Crack did not create poverty, segregation, gang rivalry, gun ownership, family conflict, or distrust of police. It connected itself to each of them. It turned a vacant apartment into a business address. It turned unemployed time into a labour supply. It turned a neighbourhood boundary into a sales territory. It turned a handgun from a symbol of protection into a tool for enforcing commercial agreements. As more money entered the streets, sellers had more to defend, and robbers had more to take. Buyers travelled toward reliable locations. Dealers moved outward in search of less crowded markets. Independent sellers formed crews. Gang members recognised that control of a few blocks could now produce regular income. The ordinary corner began to acquire a price, and once a street corner had a price, the people standing on it had to decide who owned it. Once crack became widely available in south-central Los Angeles, the most valuable part of the business was not always the drug itself. Cocaine could be replaced. Sellers could find another supplier. A person arrested on Monday might be replaced by someone else on Tuesday. The scarce resource was a place where customers already knew they could buy. That place might be a street corner, the entrance to an apartment complex, a parking lot, a house near a major road, or an alley that allowed buyers to arrive and leave quickly. It needed enough traffic to conceal short meetings, but not so much attention that every sale was obvious. It needed routes for escape, nearby buildings for storing drugs, and people willing to watch for police. Once customers learned the location, they returned. They told other users. The address developed a reputation. A reliable location produced money repeatedly. This is how an ordinary corner acquired a price. Imagine an intersection in South Central in 1985. During the morning, children pass on their way to school. A bus stops nearby. Workers buy coffee from a small market. By the afternoon, several young men are standing near the curb. Their behaviour does not appear organised from a distance. One leans against a wall. Another walks between the corner and an apartment building. A third watches cars as they approach. A driver slows down. The person watching the street recognises the signal and points toward another seller. Money passes through one hand. A small rock passes through another. The car moves away before the traffic light changes. The entire transaction takes less than a minute. 10 minutes later, another customer arrives. The location works because it is visible. Everyone involved in the market understands where to go. That same visibility creates danger. Police officers can see the activity. Rival sellers can see it. Robbers can estimate how much cash may be present. Residents can identify the people involved, even when they're too frightened or distrustful to speak publicly. The seller therefore needs protection. Protection can mean a lookout positioned where police cars become visible before they reach the corner. It can mean a runner carrying only a few rocks so the main supply remains elsewhere. It can mean keeping the drugs and money in different hands. It can mean using a nearby apartment, garage, or abandoned house as storage. It can also mean a firearm. The gun is not carried only to protect against the police. Arrest may end the day's business, but robbery can remove money and product immediately. A seller known to carry several $100s becomes a target. A rock house with a steady line of customers tells everyone nearby that cash is accumulating inside. The person most likely to rob a dealer may understand the business well. He knows that the victim cannot report stolen cocaine to the police. He knows that customers pay in cash. He may know when the supply arrives and how many people are guarding it. He may be a former worker, a customer, a friend, a rival, or a member of the same gang. Illegal markets create their own opportunities for crime. A dealer who is robbed has several choices, none of them safe. He can accept the loss and risk appearing weak. He can identify the robber and demand repayment. He can retaliate physically. He can send someone else to recover the money. If the suspected robber belongs to another neighbourhood group, a private theft can become a conflict between larger groups. The original dispute may involve a few $100s. The retaliation may kill someone who never saw the money. This process did not mean that every gang in Los Angeles transformed into a centralized drug organization. Early research based on South Central arrest and investigative records found that the dramatic growth of crack sales from 1983 to 1985 was driven mainly by ordinary drug dealers rather than gangs operating as unified institutions. Gang member participation increased, but gang identification did not consistently determine the structure or violence of a sales incident. The distinction is important because gang membership and drug organisation were not the same thing. A gang set could contain several independent dealers who competed with one another. One member might sell crack while another refused to participate. A successful dealer might employ friends from his set without sharing profits with the entire group. The gang could provide social connections and protection without formally controlling the business. At other locations, drug money gradually changed the character of the set. A group that had once centered on neighborhood loyalty, parties, fighting, and reputation could begin organizing more of its activity around sales. Members took on specific jobs. One person secured supply. Another managed sellers. Others watched corners, guarded houses, transported drugs, or collected debts. The line between a cultural street gang and a commercial criminal crew became less clear as cocaine profits entered existing relationships. Later research on California gangs described crack as especially profitable and found that the drug trade sometimes blurred the distinction between gangs built around neighborhood identity and groups organized mainly for illegal business. The transformation was uneven. Some sets developed disciplined sales operations. Others remained loose groups in which individuals sold independently. A dealer did not always need permission from senior gang members, but operating in a neighborhood controlled by a particular set could require negotiation. The seller might hire local members, give them free drugs, contribute money, or accept their protection. Refusing could create an enemy. The corner was valuable not because the pavement belonged legally to anyone, but because control could be enforced. A seller who tried to operate without local support might be threatened, robbed, beaten, or shot. A competing crew could be warned once and attacked if it returned. Territory had existed in Los Angeles gang culture before crack. Neighborhood names, schools, parks, housing projects, and streets already carried meaning. Graffiti marked presence and challenged rivals. Young people understood boundaries that were not shown on official maps. Crack attached income to those boundaries. A block that once represented identity could now produce hundreds or thousands of dollars. Losing access to it meant more than losing respect. It meant losing customers, workers, and cash. Defending territory became an economic act as well as a social one. This did not create a stable system of ownership. Boundaries were disputed. Some changed depending on the hour. A daytime seller might control a location until another crew arrived in the evening. An apartment building could contain residents connected to different gangs. Customers ignored boundaries when searching for drugs, bringing traffic into areas where outsiders were already viewed with suspicion. A seller could claim a corner without controlling every person who lived nearby. Residents were expected to tolerate the claim. A family whose house faced an active market did not receive part of the profit. It received the traffic, arguments, threats, discarded pipes, police attention, and possibility of gunfire. A homeowner who confronted sellers might be ignored or intimidated. Calling the police could bring retaliation from dealers, while doing nothing allowed the market to continue. Some residents fought back. They photographed license plates, attended community meetings, reported suspected drug houses, organised marches, and pressured city officials. Churches opened their doors for anti-drug campaigns. Parents stood on corners to discourage sales. Neighbourhood groups demanded that landlords remove tenants operating crack houses. These efforts required unusual courage because the people being challenged often lived nearby. A resident could not return to a distant suburb after a meeting. The dealer might know where her children attended school. The lookout might be the son of someone she had known for years. The person creating fear on the block could also be a neighbour, cousin, former student or child she remembered playing in the same yard. This made community resistance emotionally complicated. People wanted the selling to stop, but they did not always want every young person involved to disappear into prison. They understood that some sellers were dangerous. They also knew that others were teenagers drawn by cash, status, fear, or family need. A mother could condemn the market while hiding her own son when police arrived. The business depended on these overlapping loyalties. Dealers used homes belonging to relatives or partners. A grandmother might not know that drugs were hidden in a back room. A girlfriend might allow money to be stored in her apartment without understanding the full operation. Another resident might cooperate willingly in exchange for rent, drugs, or protection. Rock houses could range from ordinary residences with occasional sales to heavily controlled locations serving large numbers of buyers. At the height of his operation, Ricky Donnell Ross described running dozens of rock houses and supplying other locations, where mid-level dealers purchased quantities for resale. He portrayed the business as a double-up, in which an investor could spend $100 and try to turn it into $200. Federal investigators concluded that Ross built a major distribution network, while also finding that he was not solely responsible for the wider Los Angeles crack market. A successful house required organisation. The main supply might be kept away from the room where sales occurred. A worker at the door controlled entry. Another handled money. Small quantities were passed to sellers so that a police raid would not seize everything. Lookouts used whistles, gestures, shouted warnings, or telephones. Later in the decade, pagers made communication easier. Customers sometimes waited in line. That volume created temptation inside the operation. The person holding the cash might underreport sales. A runner could remove several rocks from a package. A cook preparing cocaine for sale could claim that the final amount was smaller than expected. A worker could learn the schedule and arrange a robbery. Managers responded with surveillance, threats, tests of loyalty and violence. The more money a location produced, the less trust existed around it. An operation might earn thousands of dollars, but the workers at the bottom often received small payments. Lookouts and runners accepted the danger without controlling the supply. A street seller could be arrested while the person financing the business remained elsewhere. Young workers were especially useful because adults believed juvenile penalties would be lighter, and because teenagers could move through the neighbourhood without attracting the same suspicion as an unfamiliar adult. The promise of advancement kept people involved. A lookout hoped to become a seller. A seller hoped to purchase his own supply. A mid-level dealer hoped to open a house. Each step appeared to offer greater independence and profit. Few participants reached the top. A seller could spend all day outside, complete dozens of transactions, and still owe money to the supplier. The visible cash created the impression of wealth, but product had to be replaced. Workers had to be paid. Guns, vehicles, bail, attorneys, and personal consumption took money. Robberies and seizures erased profits. The street market celebrated the moments when money arrived and concealed the costs that followed. A young dealer buying a car was visible to everyone. The same dealer sitting in a county jail months later was not. Jewellery, expensive clothing, and large cash rolls became advertisements for the trade. Funerals, legal debts, and injured family members appeared later. The market also changed the meaning of reputation. In a legal business, a good reputation may come from reliability, quality, and customer service. Those qualities also mattered in drug sales. Buyers returned to sellers whose product was considered strong and whose location remained open. But a dealer also needed a reputation for responding to theft and disrespect. If customers believed he could be robbed safely, he became a target. If workers believed they could steal without consequence, the business weakened. If rivals believed they could sell on his corner, the territory disappeared. Violence became a form of communication. One beating or shooting could warn many people. The purpose was not always to kill the individual target. It was to establish what would happen to anyone who behaved in the same way. The warning rarely remained controlled. A public attack created pressure for retaliation. Friends and relatives of the victim expected a response. Gang identity widened the number of people considered responsible. Someone who had not participated in the original dispute could be attacked because he belonged to the same set or lived in the same area. The target of retaliation might survive. A bystander might not. Drive-by shootings allowed attackers to enter rival territory and leave quickly. Cars had been used in gang violence before the crack era, but the combination of profitable markets, territorial disputes, and expanding firearm availability increased the risks. Attackers could fire toward a group without identifying the specific person responsible for an earlier offence. A corner holding 6 people presented 6 possible victims. The bullet did not distinguish between the seller, the lookout, the friend who had stopped to talk, and the child walking past. Residents adjusted their routines. Parents told children not to gather outside in groups because a car might mistake them for gang members. Young people avoided clothing associated with particular sets. Drivers lowered music when passing through certain blocks. Families stopped using front rooms facing the street. Beds were moved away from windows. People learned to read cars. A vehicle moving slowly might carry a customer, a police officer, or a shooter. Tinted windows produced anxiety. A sudden U-turn could cause people to move behind walls or parked cars. The sound of tyres slowing outside a house could interrupt a conversation. Not every fear was justified. That did not make the fear irrational. The businesses operating near drug corners made their own adjustments. Store owners installed cameras where they could afford them. Clerks worked behind protective glass. Shops limited the number of students allowed inside at one time. Bathrooms were locked. Owners shortened hours to avoid late-night traffic. Closing early reduced income. Remaining open increased risk. Markets affected housing as well. Tenants moved away from buildings where sales were active, leaving units to people with fewer options. Property owners who invested in repairs risked seeing them damaged. Responsible landlords struggled to remove tenants when evidence was difficult to gather or witnesses refused to testify. Negligent landlords collected rent while conditions deteriorated. A single active apartment could alter an entire building. Buyers knocked on the wrong doors. People slept in hallways. Arguments occurred on staircases. Children passed customers on the way to school. Police raids damaged locks and frightened residents who had no connection to the operation. When officers entered, they often treated the location as hostile. That reaction had its own logic. Dealers and guards might be armed. Drugs could be destroyed quickly. Officers serving warrants expected resistance and moved fast. They broke doors, shouted commands, forced occupants to the floor, and searched rooms for weapons and hidden packages. For uninvolved residents nearby, the raid became another form of danger. A family could spend months asking police to close a drug house, and still be frightened when heavily armed officers arrived. Children did not necessarily understand that the weapons were pointed at suspected dealers. They saw adults in tactical clothing running through the building. Once the police left, the corner sometimes reopened. A few arrests could remove workers without changing the market. Customers returned because demand remained. Another seller recognized the opportunity. If the original organization had been weakened, competitors fought over the vacant location. Enforcement could therefore interrupt control without ending sales. The arrest of a dominant dealer might reduce violence if the market disappeared. It might increase violence if several smaller crews attempted to replace him. Police measures were judged by the number of arrests, weapons, and drugs seized. while residents judged them by whether the block remained safe after the operation ended. Those standards often produced different conclusions. The growing association between gangs and crack also changed how police identified suspects. Officers were trained to look for colours, tattoos, hand signs, graffiti, companions, and presence in a known gang area. These indicators could help identify active members. They could also include young men who dressed like their peers, lived near gang members, or had relatives involved. A person did not need to sell drugs to be entered into the mental map of a gang neighbourhood. This broad suspicion affected everyday movement. Young men were stopped, questioned, photographed, or searched. Residents saw police treating groups on sidewalks as potential criminal organisations. Officers saw people refusing to cooperate and interpreted that refusal as evidence of gang loyalty. Drug corners became places where these tensions met. Dealers feared arrest. Residents feared dealers and police tactics. Officers feared armed suspects. Young people feared being mistaken for rivals. Customers feared robbery. Everyone watched everyone else. The money moving through the market did not remain in South Central. Suppliers purchased cocaine from wholesalers connected to larger national and international networks. Cash moved upward to people who never stood on the corner and did not live near the violence. Cocaine production had expanded in South America, and wholesale prices fell during the 1980s as supply increased. Justice Department investigators estimated that the national wholesale price of a kilogram declined substantially across the decade, allowing many traffickers with access to supply to take advantage of cheaper cocaine. The lower price made street expansion easier. A dealer could purchase more product. More product could be divided into more rocks. Smaller rocks reached customers with less money. High sales volume compensated for the low price of each unit. The profits visible on the corner represented only the retail edge of a much larger system. Yet law enforcement and news cameras concentrated on the retail edge because it was exposed. A teenager selling $10 rocks was easier to arrest and photograph than a distant wholesaler moving hundreds of kilograms. A crack house could be raided. A corner could be swept. The international supply chain remained harder to see. This difference shaped public understanding. Viewers saw black teenagers holding cash and assumed that they controlled the epidemic. They rarely saw the producers, smugglers, money launderers, property owners, weapons sellers, or financial systems that supported the market. The person at the bottom became the face of the entire trade. Within South Central, people understood that the street seller had power and very little power at the same time. He could frighten a block. He might carry a gun and earn more than his parents. He could decide who sold at a particular location. Yet he remained exposed to police, robbers, rivals, suppliers, and his own workers. His authority lasted only as long as others believed he could defend it. That belief had to be renewed. Sometimes it was renewed through money. A dealer paid people, helped families, sponsored parties, purchased food, or contributed to funerals. Such generosity was not always false. People involved in harmful businesses could still care about neighbours and relatives. Money created loyalty, silence, and obligation. Sometimes authority was renewed through fear. A person who cooperated with police was threatened. A seller who withheld money was beaten. A rival crew was attacked. A witness changed a statement after learning that the accused would return to the neighbourhood. This made prosecution difficult. Cases depended on officers observing transactions, recovering marked money, using informants, or finding drugs during searches. Residents who knew more than the police often remained silent because the justice system could not guarantee their safety. Silence protected dealers. It also protected families from immediate retaliation. By 1986 and 1987, the number of profitable locations had multiplied, but the market was becoming less stable. More sellers meant more competition. More competition reduced the value of personal relationships. Customers could move between nearby locations, forcing dealers to protect access and reputation. Robberies increased the demand for guns. Arrests created openings. Retaliations produced retaliations of their own. The corner no longer belonged only to the people selling there. It affected every route around it. A child's walk to school passed through it. A bus driver stopped beside it. A tenant looked down on it from an apartment window. A police officer approached it expecting weapons. A rival watched it from a moving car. The money gave the location value. The value attracted guns. The guns changed what could happen during an argument lasting only a few seconds. South Central had experienced gang shootings before crack, but the expanding drug economy supplied more disputes, more targets, more cash, and more reasons for armed people to remain in public space. What had once been a fight over reputation could now threaten a business. What had once been a neighbourhood boundary could now determine who earned money and who did not. The market had attached financial consequences to existing rivalries. The next change would come from the weapons used to settle them. By the middle of the 1980s, firearms were already part of gang violence in Los Angeles. Cars, public streets, young participants, unknown attackers, and fear of retaliation had appeared repeatedly in police records before crack became a major market. What changed during the following years was the frequency with which guns were present, the kinds of weapons available, and the speed with which a minor confrontation could become a killing. A fist fight allowed time for people to separate the participants. A knife required the attacker to come close. A gun removed those limits. A person could fire from across a street, from inside a car, or toward a group without knowing exactly who was standing there. An argument lasting a few seconds could produce several victims. The person who pulled the trigger could be gone before anyone understood what had happened. As crack sales expanded, more people began carrying weapons around places where cash and drugs were concentrated. Dealers carried guns because they feared robbery. Lookouts carried guns because they were guarding dealers. Robbers carried guns because they expected resistance. Gang members carried guns because rivals might attack them. Residents who had no role in the trade sometimes purchased firearms because they believed the police could not protect them. Each person could describe the weapon as a defensive measure. Together, those defensive measures created a heavily armed environment. Consider a young seller standing on a profitable corner in 1986. He may have several $100s in his pocket and a supply of rocks hidden nearby. He knows that another dealer has been robbed 2 blocks away. He has heard that members of a rival set have been driving through the neighbourhood. He also knows that police officers may stop and search him. The gun tucked into his waistband seems to solve several problems. It may discourage a robbery. It may give him confidence if rivals arrive. It may improve his standing among the people working around him. The weapon creates new problems at the same time. He is more likely to use it during a confrontation because it is already present. Anyone planning to rob him now expects to face a gun and arrives armed. Police officers who believe sellers are carrying weapons approach more aggressively. A rival who sees the gun assumes that waiting to be attacked is dangerous. The presence of the weapon changes everyone's behaviour before it is fired. This is one reason armed environments become difficult to reverse. People do not carry guns only because they intend to attack. They carry them because they believe other people are armed. The more guns appear, the more reasonable that fear becomes. A person who would prefer not to carry one may decide that remaining unarmed is the greater risk. For young men involved in neighbourhood gangs, the pressure could be especially strong. Reputation was connected to personal safety. Someone known for refusing to respond to threats might become a target. A person who ran from a confrontation could be ridiculed by his own companions. A seller who tolerated a robbery could lose workers and customers. A firearm offered an immediate way to prove that disrespect carried consequences. That proof often produced another funeral. The violence did not follow a clear military strategy. Contrary to the language commonly used on television, South Central was not divided between 2 unified armies called the Bloods and the Crips. Hundreds of individual sets existed across Los Angeles County, and their relationships were complicated. Crip sets fought Blood sets, but they also fought other Crip sets. Blood sets could have conflicts with other blood sets. Personal disputes could draw in people connected through family, friendship, school, or neighbourhood identity. A shooting attributed to gang rivalry might begin with a drug debt, an insult, a fight at a party, a stolen car, a romantic dispute, or a mistaken identification. Once someone was killed, the original cause became less important. The victim's friends and relatives wanted to know who had done it. Rumours spread before detectives had reliable information. A person claimed to have seen a particular car. Someone else heard that a rival set was responsible. A third person said the shooting had been planned for weeks. Retaliation could be organised before the facts were established. The goal was not always to punish the individual gunman. In many cases, the actual shooter was unknown. Instead, attackers looked for someone associated with the suspected group. That widened the number of possible targets. A young man could be killed because he belonged to the same set, lived in the same neighbourhood, attended the same party, or stood beside someone believed to be involved. The next shooting created another group of people seeking revenge. This was the cycle residents meant when they said the violence never ended. They did not necessarily mean that gunfire occurred every minute. They meant that each attack remained active through memory, rumour, fear, and obligation. Weeks could pass before retaliation. Months could pass. The people involved might believe they had been waiting patiently rather than ending the dispute. Police investigators studying Los Angeles gang violence before the height of the crack era found that these incidents were more likely than other violent crimes to occur in public, involve cars and guns, include multiple participants, and feature suspects unknown to the victims. Witnesses were often afraid to cooperate. Those patterns were already established in cases from 1978 through 1982, and became increasingly dangerous as more firearms entered the streets. The car was particularly important. A vehicle allowed attackers to enter a rival area without remaining there for long. It concealed weapons and the number of occupants. It allowed someone to approach a group before being recognised and escape through streets known to the driver. Drive-by shootings were not invented by Los Angeles gangs during the crack era, but they became one of the period's most recognisable forms of violence. Imagine 4 people standing beside a parked car in the evening. They may be gang members, or some may simply be friends. Headlights approach slowly. For 1 second, nobody knows whether the driver is searching for an address, buying drugs, or preparing to shoot. The windows lower. Several shots are fired. The attackers may aim at one person, but shooting from a moving car is imprecise. Bullets strike walls, vehicles, windows, and people who were never intended as targets. The car accelerates away. Witnesses disagree about its colour and model. Some saw faces. Others drop to the ground before they could look. A person who survives may refuse to identify the attacker because the police cannot protect him every hour afterward. A family member may know who is responsible and remain silent because another child still lives in the neighbourhood. This silence frustrated detectives, but it was not always caused by loyalty to gangs. It could be a practical response to the limits of witness protection and the proximity of the suspected killers. The police might leave after taking a statement. The witness had to remain. The scale of the violence became visible in county homicide records. A later medical study reviewing gang-related killings in Los Angeles County from 1979 through 1994 identified 7,288 deaths. Within the areas covered by the Los Angeles Police Department and Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, the proportion of homicides classified as gang-related rose from 18.1% to 43%. More than 9 out of 10 victims were male, and most were between 15 and 34 years old. About 1/4 of the gang-related homicides occurred in drive-by shootings. The use of firearms rose sharply across the study period. Guns were involved in 71.4% of gang-related homicides in 1979 and 94.5% by 1994. Researchers also recorded a dramatic increase in killings involving semi-automatic handguns. That change affected what happened after a person decided to shoot. A revolver generally held 5 or 6 rounds before it had to be reloaded. A semi-automatic pistol could hold more ammunition in a detachable magazine and be reloaded more quickly. The practical difference was significant during an attack on a group or an exchange of gunfire. More rounds could be fired in less time. That did not mean every gang member suddenly possessed a military-style weapon. Cheap revolvers, hunting weapons, stolen handguns and older firearms remained common. News coverage often focused on the most alarming guns recovered during police raids, creating the impression that every corner was defended with automatic rifles. The broader shift was still real. Semi-automatic handguns became more common, and some crews obtained rifles, shotguns and converted weapons. Larger drug profits made expensive guns easier to purchase, while theft and illegal resale placed weapons into the hands of people who could not buy them legally. The legal origin of a firearm did not prevent it from entering the illegal market. A gun might be purchased by someone with a clean record and transferred to another person. It might be stolen from a house or vehicle. It might pass between friends, relatives, gang members, and dealers. By the time police recovered it after a shooting, several owners could separate the weapon from its first retail sale. Young people were drawn into this market despite laws preventing them from purchasing handguns directly. An older acquaintance could buy a weapon. A seller could trade a gun for drugs. Someone leaving a gang or needing money could sell one privately. A firearm used in one shooting could be passed to another person, making it difficult to connect the weapon to a particular offender. Guns circulated as tools, protection, status symbols and commodities. A teenager could hold one for the first time without planning to kill anyone. He might pose for friends, carry it to a party or keep it under a mattress. The danger came partly from how quickly possession became use. An argument at a party once ending with punches could now involve someone retrieving a gun from a car. A confrontation outside a school could continue that evening through a shooting. A person embarrassed in front of friends no longer had to wait to gather several people for a fight. He could return armed. The firearm shortened the distance between anger and irreversible action. Alcohol and drugs could shorten it further. People experiencing fear, intoxication, paranoia, or excitement made decisions while weapons were within reach. Crack itself did not automatically make users violent, and research never supported the idea that every person who smoked it became an attacker. Violence was more strongly connected to the illegal market surrounding the drug, the carrying of guns, disputes over money, and the conditions under which sales occurred. The distinction was often lost in public discussion. Politicians and television reports referred to crack-fueled violence as if the chemical substance were firing the weapons. That explanation made the crisis appear to come from individual users rather than from a combination of market competition, poverty, gangs, retaliation, gun availability, and weak protection for witnesses. Researchers examining the early Los Angeles crack market found inconsistent evidence that gang participation itself caused violence in every sale. The relationship among crack, gangs, and shootings was real but complicated. Gang involvement increased during the market's expansion, while many early dealers were independent and many violent gang disputes had causes other than drug sales. Residents rarely had the luxury of separating the causes while gunfire was occurring. They changed how they used their homes. A front bedroom facing the street could be considered unsafe. Parents placed children in rooms at the back of the house or moved beds below window level. Heavy furniture was positioned against walls. Families avoided sitting near large windows after dark. When shots began, adults shouted instructions that children had heard before. Get down, move away from the window, stay on the floor, do not go outside. A child who learned these rules was learning the architecture of gunfire. Interior walls were safer than exterior walls. Bathtubs could provide more protection than beds. The side of the house away from the street was preferable. turning on lights near a window could make movement visible from outside. These were not lessons families wanted to teach. They taught them because the alternative was pretending the risk did not exist. Schools adapted as well. Administrators worried about weapons being carried onto campuses or stored nearby. Security officers searched students. Dress codes restricted colours, hats, shoelaces, and clothing associated with specific gangs. Rival groups were separated when officials expected trouble. Teachers sometimes began the school day by learning that a student had been killed overnight. The empty desk remained in the room. Classmates reacted differently. Some cried, some became angry, others appeared unaffected because visible emotion could be interpreted as weakness. A student might know who was responsible and say nothing. Another might already be planning retaliation. Counsellors attempted to manage grief in schools where several students could be killed within one academic year. A funeral did not necessarily end attendance problems or improve behaviour. It could deepen them. Friends missed class to visit the victim's family, attend memorials, or remain home because they feared another shooting. Students associated with a rival neighbourhood avoided school temporarily. Teachers were asked to continue lessons while the social life of the campus revolved around the death. Funerals themselves became dangerous. A service gathered relatives, friends, and gang members in one location. Rivals knew where the group would be. Police sometimes monitored churches and cemeteries because retaliation could occur during or after the burial. Families attempted to mourn while watching passing cars. Photographs of the victim were printed on shirts. Murals appeared on walls. Candles, flowers, bottles, handwritten notes, and stuffed animals marked the place where a person had died. These memorials gave residents somewhere to gather. They could also mark territory, preserve the identity of the victim's gang, and keep a conflict visible. The victim was often described differently depending on who was speaking. Police records might identify him as a known gang member. Relatives remembered a son, brother, father, student, or musician. Both descriptions could be true. Reducing the person to a gang label made the killing easier for outsiders to dismiss. The assumption was that someone involved in gang life had accepted the risk, and therefore required less public concern. Families did not experience the loss that way. A mother did not mourn a classification. She mourned the child she'd raised. A younger sibling did not care whether police considered the death gang motivated. The absence at breakfast, the clothing left in a room, and the voice missing from the house were the same. Emergency workers encountered the physical results before most of the public did. Paramedics entered scenes where shooters might still be nearby. They treated multiple patients under poor lighting while crowds gathered. They had to decide who could be saved first. They sometimes returned to the same intersections and apartment complexes repeatedly. Emergency departments at hospitals serving South Central treated severe gunshot wounds with increasing regularity. Doctors and nurses saw injuries more commonly associated with battlefields, multiple bullet wounds, damaged organs, shattered bones, and catastrophic blood loss. The comparison to war came partly from these medical scenes. But the patients were not soldiers returning from a distant front. They were teenagers brought from streets near their homes. Many survived with permanent disabilities. A person shot in the spine might require a wheelchair for the rest of his life. Damage to the abdomen could lead to repeated surgery. Brain injuries changed memory, personality, speech, and movement. These survivors rarely appeared in homicide statistics. Their families absorbed the cost of long-term care. A grandmother changed bandages. A parent modified a house for a wheelchair. A partner left work for medical appointments. Public hospitals and rehabilitation programs managed needs extending long after the television crews had gone. The fear also affected people who were never physically injured. Repeated exposure to gunfire produces stress. Residents slept lightly, avoided public spaces, and reacted strongly to sudden sounds. Parents worried whenever children were late. Young people scanned crowds and cars for threats even while attending school or visiting relatives. At the time, few news reports used terms such as trauma or post-traumatic stress when describing black children in South Central. Those terms were more commonly associated with soldiers or victims of exceptional disasters. For neighbourhood children, the disaster was repeated and ordinary. The national firearm crisis was also becoming more severe among young people. A federal public health report found that in 1988, firearms were involved in 77% of homicides among American teenagers aged 15 to 19. Among black males in that age group, the share was 88%. Los Angeles County's gang-related homicide rate revealed an even more concentrated danger. Among black males aged 15 to 19, the rate increased from about 60 deaths per 100,000 people per year in 1979 through 1981 to more than 192 per 100,000 in 1989 through 1991. These numbers describe a level of risk that is difficult to understand from outside the affected neighbourhoods. They do not mean that every teenager was likely to die. They show that death was occurring often enough to shape the expectations of an entire generation. A young person could know several victims before reaching adulthood. He could attend more funerals than weddings. He could assume that carrying a gun was practical because people his age had already been killed. The fear encouraged more weapon carrying, which increased the chance that ordinary confrontations would become fatal. Police officers responded to the growing number of guns by changing how they approached the neighbourhood. A traffic stop was no longer treated as routine if officers believed the occupants might be gang members. A suspected drug house was entered with heavier equipment. Groups of young men were ordered to show their hands and move away from waistbands. Officers approached cars from angles intended to reduce their exposure to gunfire. Some of these precautions reflected genuine danger. Police officers were attacked, and suspects did carry weapons. The same precautions also made every encounter more tense. A frightened teenager moving too quickly could be interpreted as reaching for a gun. An officer's aggressive command could produce panic or anger. Residents saw guns pointed at people who had not yet been proven to have committed a crime. The police believed the neighbourhood was heavily armed. The neighbourhood saw heavily armed police. Both perceptions reinforced the idea that South Central had become battlefield. The language of war began influencing policy. Drug dealers were enemies, streets were territory, police operations were attacks. Officials promised to take neighbourhoods back. War language made large deployments and aggressive tactics sound necessary. It also encouraged the belief that everyone found within the designated area belonged to one side or the other. The reality remained more complicated. The majority of residents were trying to avoid both gangs and violent police encounters. They wanted guns removed, shootings solved, and dangerous people arrested. They also wanted officers to distinguish between suspects and neighbours. That distinction became harder to maintain as the homicide count rose. In 1987 and 1988, each major shooting increased political pressure for a visible response. Newspapers reported children and bystanders killed by stray bullets. Television showed grieving parents demanding action. Police leaders argued that ordinary patrol methods were inadequate against mobile armed gangs. The department prepared to answer concentrated street violence with concentrated police force. Large numbers of officers would enter selected neighbourhoods at once. They would stop cars, search suspected gang members, serve warrants, and make arrests for offences ranging from serious felonies to minor violations. Commanders believed overwhelming presence could disrupt the gangs and restore control. Many residents supported strong action because they were exhausted by the gunfire. They would soon learn what strong action meant when it was applied across an entire neighbourhood. The violence did not remain on the street. It entered houses through phone calls, hospital visits, unpaid bills, missing property, frightened children, and the empty rooms left behind after someone was killed or imprisoned. It changed where families placed their furniture, when they went shopping, which schools children attended, and how long adults waited before opening the front door. It made ordinary routines depend on conditions that could change from one block to the next. For people watching television from outside South Central Los Angeles, the crack crisis was often presented as a sequence of police raids and shootings. A reporter stood behind yellow tape, Officers displayed bags of cocaine and recovered weapons. A covered body was placed into an ambulance. The report ended, and another story began. The people living nearby could not change the channel. They remained after the police cars left. They swept broken glass from sidewalks, repaired doors damaged during raids, and explained to children why a person they knew would not be coming home. They still had to prepare meals, pay rent, attend work, and get everyone to school the next morning. A neighbourhood under pressure does not stop performing the tasks required for daily life. The tasks simply become harder. Imagine a mother living in a small house near an active drug corner in 1987. She wakes before sunrise because she works across town and must take 2 buses. Before leaving, she checks that her older child understands when to collect the younger ones from school. She reminds them not to take the shortest route home because a shooting occurred there several days earlier. The children have heard the warning before. They know which apartment building receives customers throughout the afternoon. They know not to stare at people standing near the entrance. They know that a group of young men on one side of the street may represent a different neighbourhood from a group standing several blocks away. The mother does not describe these instructions as survival training. She describes them as common sense. When she returns after dark, she looks along the block before walking from the bus stop. If several unfamiliar cars are parked near the corner, she takes a longer route. Once inside, she locks the door and checks the windows. The children have completed some homework, but one says he could not concentrate because a helicopter had been circling overhead. Later, several shots are heard. Everyone in the house becomes quiet. No one needs to ask what to do. The children move away from the windows. An adult turns off a light near the front of the house. Someone checks the floor to make sure the youngest child has stayed low. They wait for sirens. After several minutes, conversation begins again. The interruption may last only a short time, but the body does not immediately return to normal. The adults continue listening. Children notice every car passing outside. Sleep comes slowly. The next day, the family may learn that the shooting involved people they did not know. It may have occurred 2 blocks away. Nobody in the house was injured. That does not make the night harmless. Repeated fear changes how people understand home. A house is supposed to separate the family from outside danger. Doors, walls, and windows create a boundary. Gunfire weakens that confidence because bullets do not respect the boundary. Residents moved beds away from street-facing windows. Children slept in interior rooms or on floors when violence was expected. Parents limited time outdoors even during warm evenings. Family gatherings ended early because relatives did not want to drive home late. These choices reduced risk. They also reduced freedom. A child looking through a window at friends playing outside did not necessarily understand why the rules had changed. He understood only that adults were afraid. Another child ignored the restriction, believing that staying indoors made him look weak. Parents then faced a problem with no reliable solution. Allowing children outside exposed them to danger. Keeping them inside could produce resentment, isolation, and conflict. The pressure entered relationships between parents and teenagers. Adults warned young people to avoid gangs, but avoidance was not always simple. Gang members might attend the same school, live in the same apartment building, or belong to the same extended family. A teenager could have friends from childhood who later joined a set. Refusing to associate with them might not be possible without leaving the neighbourhood. Some young people joined gangs for protection. Others carried themselves as if they belonged to one because appearing unprotected could invite harassment. A teenager might wear neutral clothing, avoid certain colours, and still be questioned because of where he lived. Parents tried to control appearance and movement. Do not wear that hat. Do not stand on that corner. Do not ride in that car. Come home before dark. Call when you arrive. The instructions could sound excessive to a young person who had not yet been attacked. To the parent, they were attempts to control the few things that remained controllable. Adults also understood that police might interpret the same child differently. A teenager stopped by officers could be questioned about gang membership based on his clothing, companions, address, or presence in a known gang area. Parents taught children to keep their hands visible, speak carefully, and avoid sudden movements. The lesson was not an endorsement of police authority or a rejection of it. It was an effort to prevent an encounter from escalating. Children learned two forms of caution. One applied when gang members approached. The other applied when police approached. The family home became the place where these rules were taught, repeated, and sometimes argued over. Crack use created a different kind of instability inside households. A person struggling with addiction might disappear for hours or days. Money intended for food, rent, or utilities could be spent in a series of small purchases. Property vanished from the house. Trust weakened because every explanation had to be tested against earlier lies. A family member might search pockets, hide cash, or lock a bedroom door. Jewellery was moved to another relative's house. Children were warned not to give money to a parent, sibling, or uncle who asked for it. These were painful instructions because they reversed ordinary family obligations. People were expected to help relatives in need. Addiction made it difficult to know whether help would pay for food, transportation, or another rock. A mother could refuse money to her adult son and then spend the night wondering where he was sleeping. A sister could change the locks after a television was stolen and still leave food outside. A grandmother could take custody of grandchildren while hoping their parent would return to treatment. The same person might be loved, feared, pitied, and distrusted. Treatment services struggled to match the speed of the crisis. Los Angeles County data from 1981 through 1987 showed cocaine becoming the area's fastest growing drug problem, with increases in drug-related deaths, emergency room cases, and treatment admissions. Cocaine had moved above heroin in deaths and emergency room admissions by 1984, and the largest increases were recorded between 1985 and 1986. The available treatment system had developed largely around alcohol and heroin. Cocaine dependence created different problems. There was no direct equivalent to methadone maintenance, and people experiencing a strong urge to use often needed immediate help rather than an appointment several weeks later. Publicly funded programs had limited space. By 1989, Los Angeles County had only dozens of publicly funded detoxification beds, and some people seeking help were told to wait for weeks. Treatment workers reported that applicants frequently disappeared, were arrested, or changed their minds before a place became available. For a family, the delay could feel impossible. A person might agree to enter treatment during a moment of exhaustion or fear. By the following day, the desire to use had returned. Relatives tried to keep the person indoors, remove access to money, or accompany them to clinics. These efforts could produce arguments, threats, and physical confrontations. When treatment was unavailable, the criminal justice system often became the most immediate institution willing to take control. An arrest temporarily removed someone from the street. It did not necessarily provide recovery. The burden also fell on children whose parents were using crack. Some lived with relatives for long periods. Others moved between homes, schools, and temporary arrangements. Older siblings prepared meals, supervised younger children, and managed household responsibilities that adults were no longer performing reliably. The children were not responsible for the crisis. They were required to adapt to it. Schools saw the results each morning. A student arrived late because police had blocked the street after a shooting. Another fell asleep in class because arguments and customer traffic continued near the apartment throughout the night. A child had not eaten breakfast because money was missing from the house. A teenager was absent because the family feared retaliation after an older brother had been shot. Teachers worked with information they could not always verify. Students did not necessarily explain what was happening. They might describe a parent as sick, say that they had been staying with an aunt, or refuse to discuss the reason for moving. School records showed changes in attendance and performance. The personal causes remained hidden. Campuses also brought together students from different territories. A school boundary created by the district did not necessarily follow gang boundaries, understood by young people. Students who would avoid one another on the street shared hallways, lunch areas, and bus stops. An insult could lead to a fight. The fight could continue after school. Friends and older gang members might arrive. If guns appeared, school officials had limited ability to contain what began beyond the campus. Administrators increased security and restricted clothing associated with gangs. Students were searched, entrances were monitored. Police officers appeared more frequently around schools. These measures could prevent weapons from entering. They could also make students feel that their school was being run as a detention facility. Teachers had to establish trust while enforcing rules created by fear. A student wearing a particular colour might be expressing gang identity, following fashion, or wearing the only clean shirt available. Staff members were expected to make immediate judgments. Students made judgments too. They observed which young people were searched, which groups were monitored, and how police spoke to them. The school became another place where the conflict between safety and control played out. Deaths interrupted education in a more direct way. A teacher could arrive to find that a student had been killed during the night. A desk remained empty. Friends gathered outside the classroom. Some students cried openly. Others laughed, talked loudly, or appeared indifferent because they did not know how else to behave. Grief counsellors were not always available in sufficient numbers. Teachers continued with lessons because the school day had to continue. Students were expected to complete assignments while rumours about retaliation moved through the building. The killing could change attendance for several days. Students from the victim's neighbourhood stayed home. Those believed to be connected to rivals avoided certain routes. Police watched the school in case another attack occurred. A funeral became part of the academic calendar. Research on Los Angeles violence later documented the degree to which children and adolescents were exposed. A study of drive-by shootings in the city during 1991 identified 677 people under 18 who were shot at. Of those, 429 were wounded and 36 died. Although many of the injured were gang members, the study also demonstrated that children and teenagers who were not gang members were caught in the same attacks. The number 677 does not show what happened in the homes afterward. It does not show parents waiting in hospital corridors, siblings answering telephone calls, or classmates returning to the place where blood had been washed from the pavement. It does not show the children who were not struck but believed for several seconds that they were about to die. Hospitals became another place where the war entered family life. Emergency workers treated gunshot injuries, cocaine-related medical crises, assaults, and accidents connected to the market. A young man could arrive with several bullet wounds while friends and relatives gathered outside. Staff members worked to save him while security officers watched for additional violence. The hospital might receive the victim and the suspected attacker during the same night. Families encountered one another in waiting rooms. Police questioned witnesses. Medical staff balanced treatment with the need to preserve evidence. A shooting that lasted seconds produced hours of surgery and years of recovery. A person who survived an injury to the spine could require lifelong care. A bullet damage in the abdomen might result in repeated procedures, infections, and chronic pain. Brain injuries affected speech, memory, behaviour, and independence. The injured person returned to a family already managing limited income and unstable housing. Someone had to provide care. A parent left work for medical appointments. A partner managed medication. Relatives modified rooms for a wheelchair. Public assistance and hospital programs covered some needs, but daily support came from people inside the home. Survival was not the end of the event. It was the beginning of another set of responsibilities. Deaths created their own financial burden. Families paid for funerals they had not expected to arrange. Friends collected money. Churches helped with services. Photographs were enlarged and placed near caskets. Shirts were printed with the victim's face. Funerals gathered large groups and could become targets for retaliation. Families mourned while watching unfamiliar cars and worrying about who might appear. Police sometimes monitored services because they expected gang members from rival groups. The church provided comfort and became part of the security problem at the same time. Religious organisations were among the most visible local institutions resisting the drug trade. Ministers marched through housing projects, held prayer services near suspected rock houses, and encouraged residents to report dealers. In 1986, South Los Angeles activists used slogans such as "Up with Hope, Down with Dope," while residents displayed signs reminding outsiders that good people also lived in the neighbourhood. Those signs addressed more than the dealers. They addressed the way the rest of Los Angeles viewed South Central. Residents saw television coverage presenting their neighbourhoods almost entirely through crime. The camera arrived when a body was present and left before the community meeting began. It showed barred windows without explaining why residents had installed them. It showed young men standing on corners without asking whether they were unemployed, waiting for friends, selling drugs, or simply living there. The repeated image of disorder affected how employers, banks, landlords, and outsiders treated anyone associated with the area. An address could become a stigma. A job applicant from South Central might be viewed as unreliable or dangerous. A business owner seeking credit faced assumptions about the neighbourhood. Customers from other areas avoided local shops. Property values suffered from the reputation created by violence and reinforced through news coverage. The drug market damaged businesses directly as well. Stores near active corners lost customers. Owners paid for bars, cameras, stronger doors, and protective glass. Clerks worried about robberies and confrontations. Bathrooms were locked to prevent drug use. Some shops refused to allow more than a few young people inside at one time. These policies protected employees. They also made every customer feel suspected. Business owners faced pressure from several directions. Dealers wanted access to parking lots and sidewalks. Residents expected owners to report illegal activity. Police questioned whether stores were allowing sales. Gang members might demand free goods or money. Closing early reduced exposure to danger but cut revenue during hours when working residents were available to shop. Staying open brought income and risk. Some businesses left. The empty storefront made the street less active and reduced legal employment further. The remaining liquor stores and check-cashing businesses became symbols of neighbourhood decline, even though their concentration was partly the result of other retailers refusing to invest. Housing conditions followed a similar cycle. Families with enough money moved away from buildings affected by drug traffic. Their departure left vacancies that landlords struggled to fill. Less responsible owners accepted tenants without maintaining the property. Dealers used empty apartments, garages, and abandoned houses. A damaged building attracted more illegal activity. The activity caused more damage. Residents who remained were blamed for conditions they had little power to change. The pressure was particularly severe in public housing developments. Large numbers of families lived close together, and architectural features created areas difficult to monitor. Walkways, courtyards, stairwells, and parking spaces could become selling locations or escape routes. Yet these developments were also communities. Residents knew one another, shared childcare, organised events, and watched for danger. The same density that helped a drug market operate also allowed information to travel quickly. A stranger was noticed. A police raid was known across the development within minutes. Families warned one another when shooting began. Community knowledge provided protection. It also created pressure to remain silent. A witness might identify a suspect immediately but know that the suspect's relatives lived nearby. Reporting information could divide families, friendships, and entire buildings. Police promised confidentiality, but residents doubted that secrets would remain secret. Research on gang violence in Los Angeles found fear of retaliation to be a recurring feature of cases, along with public locations, firearms, cars, multiple participants, and suspects unknown to victims. The silence, often described as community indifference, was therefore something more complicated. People cared deeply. They were calculating what might happen after they spoke. Community activists tried to break that isolation. Hotlines allowed anonymous reports. Ministers walked with residents. Neighbourhood groups distributed information about recognising drug sales and helping children avoid gangs. Some people repeatedly called the police despite threats. Their work challenged the claim that residents tolerated the crisis. Many had been demanding action for years. The disagreement concerned what kind of action would help. Residents wanted dangerous dealers removed, but they also wanted treatment, jobs, youth programs, reliable schools, and protection for witnesses. They wanted police to respond without treating every young black man as a gang member. City institutions found it easier to measure arrests than restored trust. An arrest could be counted. A prevented addiction could not. A seized gun could be displayed. A teenager persuaded to finish school did not produce a press conference. This favoured policies that created visible activity. Meanwhile, family structures continued absorbing the consequences. Grandparents raised children, women managed homes while sons, partners or brothers were incarcerated or dead. Older children became substitute parents. Relatives combined incomes to prevent eviction. The phrase broken family was often used to describe these households. The phrase ignored the work required to hold them together. A grandmother taking in 3 children was not evidence that the family had disappeared. She was evidence that it was still functioning under extreme pressure. An aunt paying rent for 2 households was not proof of dependency. She was replacing support that the labour market and public institutions had failed to provide. Women carried much of this burden while also facing the direct effects of crack. Some developed addictions. Some were exploited by dealers or partners. Some exchanged sex for money, drugs, shelter or protection. Some lost custody of children. Pregnant women who used crack became a major subject of sensational news coverage and punitive policy. The public discussion often treated them as threats to their babies rather than patients requiring medical care. Later research would challenge many of the most extreme claims made about so-called crack babies. Poverty, inadequate prenatal care, alcohol, tobacco, violence, and other conditions were frequently ignored while cocaine was used as a complete explanation. During the panic, the image of the crack-using mother served a political purpose. It allowed the crisis to be described as personal immorality rather than a public health emergency. Fathers were discussed differently. Men appeared in news reports mainly as dealers, gang members, prisoners, or absent parents. Less attention was paid to men working multiple jobs, caring for children, coaching teams, leading church programs, or trying to protect families without becoming involved in street conflict. The neighbourhood was simplified into categories: victim, dealer, gang member, addict, police officer. The categories concealed the fact that one family could contain all of them. A police officer might have relatives living in South Central. A dealer could be a father. A person with an addiction might also be a victim of violence. A gang member could hold a legal job and care for younger siblings. A resident demanding aggressive enforcement could later protest police misconduct. The contradictions were not unusual. They were the normal shape of life inside the crisis. By the end of the decade, many people were exhausted. They had attended meetings, called police, moved children between schools, helped relatives seek treatment, and buried people they loved. They had watched politicians promise action, and news crews describe the neighbourhood as if it were already lost. The violence had not destroyed every block. It had changed expectations. Residents expected interruptions. They expected the helicopter to return. They expected another arrest, another funeral, another family asking for help with children. They prepared for trouble even on quiet nights. At the same time, they continued building ordinary life around it. Children graduated, couples married, businesses opened, churches held services. Families cooked meals and celebrated birthdays. People laughed on porches when the street was calm enough to allow it. This persistence was not evidence that the crisis had been exaggerated. It was evidence that communities do not surrender all at once. The city now faced pressure to prove that it could restore order. Residents demanded relief. Police leaders argued that gangs and drug markets had become too heavily armed for ordinary methods. Political officials wanted operations large enough to be seen and remembered. The answer would not arrive mainly through clinics, schools, employment offices, or neighbourhood organisations. It would arrive in police buses, patrol cars, helicopters, tactical equipment, and lines of officers moving through the streets. By the beginning of 1988, officials in Los Angeles were under intense pressure to show that they could control gang violence. The number of shootings had risen. Crack markets remained active. Residents were demanding protection, and television reports repeatedly showed armed young men grieving families and street corners that appeared to belong more to dealers than to the city. The Los Angeles Police Department had already created gang units, narcotics teams, tactical forces, helicopter patrols, and specialized investigative programs. Officers made arrests every day, warrants were served, guns and drugs were seized. The public still saw people being killed. Police Chief Daryl Gates responded with a strategy intended to be larger, faster, and more visible than ordinary enforcement. Hundreds of officers would enter selected areas at the same time. They would stop suspected gang members, search for weapons, check warrants, enforce traffic laws, cite minor violations, impound vehicles, and arrest as many people as legally possible. The operation became known as the Hammer. The name was not accidental. It described the department's intention to apply force across a broad area rather than wait for detectives to build individual cases one at a time. Gates said the sweeps were designed to make life difficult for gang members and their associates, including through arrests for relatively minor offences. Contemporary reporting described the approach as an effort to make life miserable for anyone openly identifying as a gang member. For residents exhausted by shootings, this could sound reasonable. If young men carrying guns were controlling the streets, send enough officers to take the streets back. If dealers were using cars to sell crack, seize the cars. If wanted gang members were gathering in public, check everyone for warrants. The theory was easy to explain. Its consequences were more complicated. Imagine a Friday evening in south-central Los Angeles in early 1988. The sun is going down, and people are returning from work. Children are still outside. Cars move along the larger streets while families prepare dinner inside nearby houses. Then the police begin arriving. Patrol cars enter from several directions. Officers from different divisions assemble at command posts. Helicopters move overhead. Vans and buses are prepared to transport detainees. Supervisors divide officers into teams and direct them toward places identified through crime reports, gang intelligence, narcotics investigations, and the knowledge of local patrol officers. The operation is designed to be noticed. That is part of its purpose. A small group of officers can arrest one suspect. Hundreds of officers filling several neighbourhoods send a message. Police officials want gang members to understand that the department can appear in overwhelming numbers. They want residents to see that the government has not surrendered. The sudden concentration of police also creates uncertainty for everyone on the street. A young man wearing a red or blue item may be stopped because officers believe the clothing indicates gang affiliation. Another may be questioned because of his posture, hand gestures, companions, tattoos, or presence in an area associated with a gang. A car may be pulled over for a traffic violation and searched when officers suspect drugs or weapons. During 4 nights of sweeps between February 26th and the middle of March 1988, a specially assembled force of about 200 officers arrested or cited more than 1,600 people, seized 28 guns, and impounded 263 vehicles. Police openly stated that young men displaying gang colours, making suspected gang signs, or adopting what officers viewed as gang mannerisms were likely to be stopped. Those numbers looked impressive in press conferences. More than 1,600 people had been removed from the streets or formally contacted. Hundreds of vehicles had been taken. Weapons had been recovered. The The numbers did not show how many of those people were later charged with serious crimes. They did not show how many were simply cited for traffic violations, curfew violations, public drinking, outstanding warrants, or other minor offences. They also did not show how many residents had been forced to the ground, searched, questioned, and released without being arrested. That difference became central to the controversy surrounding Operation Hammer. Police officials argued that minor enforcement mattered because it disrupted the environment in which gangs operated. A person arrested for an outstanding traffic warrant might also be involved in violence that detectives had been unable to prove. A vehicle impounded for licensing violations could no longer be used in a drive-by shooting. A group dispersed from a corner could not sell drugs there for the rest of the evening. The strategy was not built only around prosecuting major cases, it was built around pressure. The police wanted gang members to feel watched, interrupted, and unable to move freely. They wanted to remove weapons before they were used. They also wanted to establish that public space belonged to the city, rather than to a neighbourhood set. Supporters saw the sweeps as overdue. Some residents reported that streets felt quieter when hundreds of officers were present. Community activists who had spent years asking the city to confront dealers welcomed the increased attention. Local political leaders argued that police were finally contacting people who had previously acted without consequences. Contemporary reporting recorded residents expressing pleasure at the visible enforcement and wishing that similar operations occurred more often. Their support was not difficult to understand. A family living beside an active drug corner might care less about the legal theory of mass enforcement than about being able to sleep without gunfire. A store owner repeatedly threatened by gang members might welcome officers stopping every suspicious car. A mother whose child had been killed might believe that aggressive tactics were justified if they prevented another funeral. For these residents, complaints about police methods could sound disconnected from the emergency. They had already tried calling individual officers. They had attended meetings. They had asked for patrols. The killings had continued. Other residents viewed the same operation as collective punishment. They watched officers stop large numbers of Black and Latino young men based on appearance, location, and police intelligence that was not always accurate. People were ordered onto sidewalks or against police cars. Vehicles were searched and impounded. Entire groups were detained while officers checked names for warrants. The operation assumed that broad contact with suspected gang populations would produce useful arrests. It also meant that being young, male, and present in a targeted neighbourhood could be enough to attract police attention. Gang identification was not a precise science. Officers used admissions, tattoos, clothing, known associates, photographs, previous contacts, and information placed into gang files. Some of these indicators were reliable, others were open to interpretation. A person could be photographed beside friends and entered into police intelligence records. A teenager might wear a local sports team's colour without belonging to a gang. Someone could admit an affiliation during one encounter for protection or status, and later deny that he had ever become an active member. Once the label appeared in police records, it could shape future encounters. The officer stopping the person did not approach an unknown resident. He approached a documented gang member. That changed the tone of the stop before anyone spoke. Officers participating in Operation Hammer faced real risks. Gang members had killed and wounded people with handguns, rifles, and shotguns. Drug houses could contain armed guards. A routine traffic stop could become a shooting. The officers were therefore trained to establish control quickly. Hands had to remain visible. People were ordered out of vehicles. Groups were separated. Weapons were drawn when officers believed a threat was present. From the police perspective, hesitation could be fatal. From the ground, these tactics could appear indistinguishable from an assault. A person who had committed no crime might find himself lying face down while a helicopter illuminated the street. Several police cars could surround one vehicle. Officers approached with guns drawn because they did not know whether the occupants were armed. In one detailed account of a 1989 Hammer operation, 4 young men were ordered onto the asphalt while police cars blocked the road and a helicopter circled above. Officers found no drugs or guns. The driver was arrested for driving without a licence and the vehicle was taken. To the department, the encounter demonstrated pressure and vehicle enforcement. To the people on the ground, it demonstrated how easily a large police response could be used against men who were not carrying the weapons officers expected to find. Scenes like this occurred repeatedly. The helicopter became part of the experience. It directed officers, followed vehicles, illuminated yards, and announced commands through loudspeakers. Its constant movement told residents that the operation covered more than one intersection. People stepped onto porches to watch. Children gathered near windows until adults ordered them away. Some residents applauded arrests. Others shouted at officers or demanded to know why neighbours were being stopped. The difference between an audience and a crowd could change quickly. Police worried that bystanders might interfere or conceal a suspect. Residents worried that officers would treat curiosity as hostility. The operation turned ordinary streets into controlled spaces. Police vehicles blocked intersections. Teams moved from one stop to another. People in handcuffs waited in rows or were transported to booking locations. An arrest board at the command post recorded totals as the night continued. The count was part of the operation's public success. Every arrest proved activity. The seriousness of those arrests varied widely. During one weekend in August 1989, 167 officers arrested 352 people. Police seized cocaine, marijuana and other drugs, but many of the recorded actions involved traffic matters. The reported charges included 30 narcotics cases and 11 other felony violations alongside 129 traffic citations. During another hammer sweep in September, about 250 officers arrested 204 people, including 121 suspected gang members. 40 suspected gang members were booked on felony accusations, and police recovered 7 guns as well as small amounts of drugs. These operations did remove people accused of serious crimes. They also swept in large numbers of people whose alleged violations did not involve shootings, major drug trafficking or violent felonies. Police leaders considered that breadth as strength. The strategy treated minor violations as opportunities to interrupt gang activity. Critics considered it evidence that the department was using arrest totals to compensate for weak individual cases. Later accounts reported that on one night, 1,453 people were arrested and 1,350 were released without charges being filed. Operation Hammer eventually produced tens of thousands of arrests, many of which did not lead to serious prosecution. For the person released, the absence of charges did not erase the experience. He had still been stopped, handcuffed, transported, photographed, questioned, or held. His car might still have been impounded. He might miss work, lose wages, or pay fees to recover property. A family member might spend hours trying to learn where he had been taken. These costs rarely appeared in the department's statistics. The broad enforcement also affected the way communities understood police legitimacy. An operation could remove a wanted shooter from the street and stop an uninvolved person during the same hour. The first action increased confidence, the second weakened it. Residents did not evaluate the operation as one single event. They evaluated what happened to people they knew. A grandmother might support the arrest of dealers outside her building, but object when officers pushed her grandson against a wall. A business owner might welcome patrols while becoming angry after customers were repeatedly stopped near the entrance. A parent might want police to question known gang members, but fear that her own child had been wrongly entered into a gang file. The department's battlefield language made those distinctions harder to preserve. If the area was a war zone, officers were entering hostile territory. If gangs were the enemy, people associated with them became enemy populations. That way of thinking encouraged aggressive control but did not fit the social reality of the neighbourhood. Gang members lived with relatives who opposed their behaviour. Dealers attended churches and schools. Young people moved in and out of gang involvement. Residents could cooperate with police one day and protest them the next. There was no clear line separating the battlefield from the home. The logic of overwhelming force reached its most destructive form during the August 1988 raids on 2 apartment buildings on Dalton Avenue near 39th Street. Dozens of officers entered the buildings looking for gang members and evidence of drug activity. What followed became one of the most notorious examples of LAPD conduct before the Rodney King beating. Police smashed walls, ceilings, windows, furniture, sinks and toilets. Residents later described extensive destruction throughout the buildings. Despite the scale of the raid, officers found no evidence of criminal activity in or around the property. Lawsuits followed, and the city eventually paid millions of dollars to settle claims arising from the operation. The Dalton Avenue raid was not an ordinary Hammer street sweep, but it grew from the same enforcement climate. Officers believed they were entering a fortified gang location. The expectation of hostility justified large numbers, tactical equipment, and destructive entry. Once inside, the operation treated the property less as a collection of homes than as a suspected enemy position. Residents saw police officers destroy the spaces where they lived. Walls were not abstract property. They separated bedrooms. Sinks and toilets were basic necessities. Furniture represented money earned and saved. Even people who wanted drug dealers removed could see that this was not the same as making an arrest. The raid became a symbol of what happened when the police treated a neighbourhood as territory to be conquered. The department continued defending aggressive gang suppression. Its leaders pointed to recovered weapons, wanted suspects, and periods in which gang-related homicide appeared to decline. During the summer of 1989, police cited a 7.3% reduction from the previous year in gang homicides within areas targeted by several Hammer sweeps. Determining whether the sweeps caused such changes was difficult. Violence rose and fell for many reasons. Rivalries changed. Arrests removed particular shooters. Drug markets moved. Weather, school schedules, retaliation cycles, and local peace efforts affected when violence occurred. A quieter weekend during a police deployment did not prove a lasting reduction. One 1989 operation resulted in 472 arrests, including 288 reputed gang members. During the same weekend, 1 person was killed and 7 were wounded in shootings described as gang-related. Police recovered 11 guns, but violence continued in areas touched by the wider enforcement campaign. This did not mean the operation accomplished nothing. It meant that mass street enforcement could disrupt behaviour without resolving the conditions producing it. An officer could remove a gun. The operation could not erase the conflict that made another person want one. Police could arrest a seller. They could not eliminate the demand for crack or the supply networks replacing him. A vehicle could be impounded. Another could be borrowed or stolen. The Hammer treated visible disorder as the immediate problem because visible disorder was what police were equipped to confront. Employment, housing, addiction treatment, school funding, witness protection, and youth services belonged to other institutions. Those institutions did not arrive with hundreds of workers on a Friday night. The police did. This imbalance gave the LAPD responsibilities it could not fulfill, and power that it did not always use carefully. Residents wanted the department to prevent violence. Officers were then judged for failing to solve social problems beyond policing. At the same time, the department often presented itself as the central institution capable of restoring order, reinforcing the belief that more enforcement was the answer. The cycle strengthened both police authority and public resentment. Operation Hammer also affected political language beyond Los Angeles. It fit the expanding national war on drugs, in which leaders described narcotics as a threat requiring tougher laws, longer sentences, asset seizures, and larger law enforcement operations. The distinction between prevention and punishment narrowed. A policy was considered successful when it produced arrests, convictions, seizures, or years of imprisonment. South Central became a testing ground for this approach. Drug buyers had vehicles seized, suspected gang members were stopped for minor violations. Civil gang injunctions were used to restrict conduct that might otherwise not have justified arrest. In 1987 and 1988, Los Angeles prosecutors pursued injunctions against the Playboy gangster Crips, attempting to prohibit activities such as intimidation, blocking sidewalks, graffiti, and behaviour linked to street drug sales. Courts rejected some of the broader restrictions, but allowed portions framed as public nuisance control. These methods expanded the government's ability to act before a serious crime had been proved. Supporters argued that traditional law was too slow for neighbourhoods being terrorised by organised groups. Critics warned that the city was weakening constitutional protections for entire categories of people. Both sides pointed to residents as justification. One side emphasised residents afraid of gangs. The other emphasised residents afraid of police. The same person could belong to both groups. Chief Gates remained a powerful figure throughout this period. He represented an LAPD tradition that valued independence, aggressive patrol, tactical innovation, and a strong public image. Supporters saw him as willing to confront crime without apologising. Critics saw a chief whose language encouraged officers to treat minority communities with suspicion and contempt. His statements mattered because they shaped the institutional mood, calling offenders cowards, promising to make their lives miserable, and using the name Hammer communicated that restraint was not the operation's defining value. Officers understood that commanders wanted results. Results were arrests, weapons, drugs, vehicles, and visible control. The quieter work of separating a dangerous suspect from an uninvolved resident was more difficult to count. By 1990, the sweeps had become part of the normal relationship between the LAPD and heavily policed communities. Young men expected to be stopped. Officers expected hostility. Residents expected helicopters, tactical units, and temporary demonstrations of force after major shootings. The drug markets remained. The gangs remained. The anger remained. The Hammer had shown that the department could place hundreds of officers into the streets and arrest hundreds of people in a single weekend. It had not shown that those neighbourhoods would be safer, healthier, or more trusting once the operation ended. Instead, it added another layer to the history accumulating across South Central. Residents remembered the crack houses and drive-by shootings. They remembered unanswered emergency calls and unsolved killings. They also remembered being stopped, searched, forced onto the ground, and treated as suspects near their own homes. All of these memories would matter when a home video recorded several LAPD officers beating a black motorist named Rodney King in March 1991. The public argument that followed would not begin with that beating. It would carry years of gang violence, failed protection, aggressive policing, mass arrests, damaged homes, and unresolved distrust into the courtroom with it. By the beginning of 1991, Los Angeles had spent years preparing for violence without resolving the conditions that produced it. The crack trade remained active. Gang shootings had taken thousands of lives across the county. Police sweeps had placed large numbers of young men in handcuffs, but many of those arrests had not resulted in serious charges. Residents had watched drug houses reopen after raids and seen officers return with helicopters, tactical teams, and buses for detainees. Families continued asking for protection, while wondering whether the police entering their neighbourhood would protect them or treat them as suspects. The city was not waiting calmly for one final event. It was carrying a large collection of unresolved events. There were the factories that had closed and the jobs that had moved. There were schools trying to manage poverty, trauma, and gang conflict with limited resources. There were families caring for children whose parents were addicted, imprisoned, injured, or dead. There were shop owners protecting businesses in areas other companies had abandoned. There were young men growing up with the expectation that they would be stopped by police, challenged by gangs, or both. There was also a police department that believed forceful control was necessary in dangerous neighbourhoods and a large section of the public that no longer trusted the department to control itself. On the night of March 3rd, 1991, those histories met on a road in the San Fernando Valley. Rodney Glenn King was 25 years old. He was driving with 2 passengers when California Highway Patrol officers attempted to stop him for speeding. King did not stop immediately. A pursuit followed, involving several police vehicles and a helicopter. King later acknowledged that he had been drinking and feared that a traffic arrest would violate his parole. That decision placed other drivers, his passengers, officers, and himself in danger. When the pursuit ended near the intersection of Foothill Boulevard and Osborne Street, police ordered the occupants out of the car. The passengers complied and were taken into custody. King emerged last. What happened next was recorded by a man named George Holliday, who lived in an apartment nearby. Awakened by the noise, Holliday took a video camera onto his balcony and filmed officers surrounding King. The recording showed King being shocked with a taser, struck repeatedly with police batons, kicked, and forced back down as he attempted to move. The video did not capture every moment of the stop, and the defence would later argue that the officers were responding to King's movements and perceived resistance. What it did capture was difficult for millions of viewers to understand as reasonable control. Officers struck King dozens of times while other officers stood nearby. King suffered fractures and other injuries. Without the recording, the incident might have entered the system as another disputed use-of-force complaint. King would have described a beating. Officers would have described resistance. Supervisors and investigators would have examined reports written within the department. The public might never have heard his name. The camera changed that. Television stations broadcast the footage repeatedly. Viewers across the United States watched officers swing batons at a man on the ground. For many white Americans with little direct experience of aggressive policing, the recording was shocking, because it contradicted the assumption that serious police brutality was rare or exaggerated. For many black residents of Los Angeles, the shock came from somewhere else. They were surprised that the incident had been filmed clearly enough for other people to see what they had been describing for years. The video appeared to remove the usual uncertainty. This was not a complaint based only on memory. It was not a witness describing an event from a distance. The beating existed on tape. People could watch it. That visibility created an expectation that the legal outcome would also be clear. 4 LAPD officers were charged in connection with the beating. The case became a national test of whether video evidence could overcome the deference traditionally given to police officers who said they had used force because they feared a suspect. At the same time, the city commissioned an independent investigation into the LAPD. The commission was led by attorney Warren Christopher and examined use-of-force reports, personnel records, complaints, officer communications, lawsuits, supervision, discipline, recruitment, and the department's internal culture. Its findings went far beyond the actions of the officers who had struck King. The commission concluded that a significant number of LAPD officers repeatedly used excessive force or improper tactics, and that the department's systems often failed to control them. Its analysis identified 63 officers who had accumulated 20 or more reports involving excessive force or improper tactics from 1986 through 1990. The Commission found problems in supervision, complaint handling, discipline, and the culture surrounding aggressive policing. These findings confirmed what critics had argued during the years of Operation Hammer. The issue was not only whether individual officers occasionally lost control. The department had institutional problems that allowed some officers to misuse force repeatedly. The report did not claim that every LAPD officer was abusive. Many officers performed difficult work without becoming the subject of repeated complaints. The Commission's point was that the department knew, or should have known, which officers created the greatest risk and had not responded effectively. Police supporters reacted defensively. They argued that officers working in violent neighbourhoods accumulated complaints because they made more arrests and encountered more dangerous suspects. They believed critics underestimated the split-second decisions required during confrontations. Residents answered that danger did not excuse repeated misconduct. The gap between these positions widened. While the King case moved toward trial, another death intensified tension between black residents and Korean-American merchants. On March 16, 1991, 13 days after the King beating, 15-year-old Latasha Harlins entered Empire Liquor Market in south-central Los Angeles. The store was owned by the family of Soon Ja-do, a Korean-American shopkeeper. Do believed Harlins was stealing a bottle of orange juice. A physical confrontation followed. Security video showed Harlins placing the bottle in her backpack while holding money in her hand. Do grabbed at her. Harlins struck Do. Harlins then placed the bottle on the counter and turned toward the exit. Do retrieved a handgun and shot Harlins in the back of the head. The girl died on the floor. A jury convicted Do of voluntary manslaughter. The judge sentenced her to probation, community service, a fine and payment of funeral expenses rather than prison. For many black residents, the sentence communicated that the life of a black child carried little weight in the justice system. The case became connected in public memory with the Rodney King beating, even though the facts and defendants were different. In one case, police officers had beaten a black man on video. In the other, a shopkeeper had shot a black girl on video. Both cases produced the expectation that the evidence would force serious punishment. Both appeared to test whether black victims would receive justice. Relations between black customers and Korean-American merchants had already become tense in parts of South Central. Korean immigration had increased after changes to federal immigration law in 1965. Many immigrants entered small retail businesses because language barriers, discrimination, and limited access to professional employment narrowed their choices. Liquor stores, groceries, beauty supply shops, and convenience stores were available in neighborhoods where larger chains had reduced investment. Korean families often worked extremely long hours and relied on relatives to operate the businesses. They entered communities with histories they did not always understand and served customers whose distrust of merchants and police had developed over decades. Black residents sometimes believed Korean shopkeepers treated them as criminals, followed them through stores, refused to hire local workers, and removed money from the neighborhood without respecting it. Korean merchants often believed they were being robbed, threatened, and abandoned by police. Some had been assaulted. They worked behind thick glass, kept weapons, and viewed unfamiliar customers with suspicion. Each group saw the other through experiences of fear. The killing of Latasha Harlins gave that fear a human face. It would later become common to describe the 1992 unrest as a conflict between black residents and Korean merchants. That description captures part of the violence but hides the larger setting. Korean-owned businesses were heavily damaged and racial hostility existed. Yet those merchants were also positioned between larger institutions. Banks had restricted investment. Major retailers had left. Police protection was unreliable. City officials had allowed commercial relationships to develop without enough mediation, employment investment, or community support. The shopkeeper behind the counter and the customer in front of it were often the final participants in a much larger history neither had created. As 1991 continued, the officers charged in the King beating prepared for trial. Defense attorneys argued that the case could not receive a fair hearing in Los Angeles because the videotape had been broadcast so widely and because local anger was too strong. The trial was moved to Simi Valley in Ventura County. The location carried immediate symbolic importance. Simi Valley was more suburban, more conservative, and less racially diverse than Los Angeles. Many law enforcement officers lived in or near the area. The jury selected for the trial included no black jurors. The law required jurors to decide the case based on evidence and instructions, not the racial composition of the city. The public understood the setting differently. To many black residents, the trial had been moved away from the people most familiar with LAPD conduct and placed before a jury unlikely to share that experience. The defense presented the videotape slowly, frame by frame. Instead of watching the beating at normal speed as television audiences had, jurors examined individual movements. Officers testified about their training, King's behaviour, the danger they believed he presented, and the rules governing baton strikes. The recording that had initially seemed simple became a technical document. Each movement could be interpreted. Was King attempting to rise or preparing to attack? Was an officer striking to punish him or to gain control? Did the number of blows prove excessive force? Or did each blow have to be judged at the exact moment it was delivered? The defence asked jurors to view the event through the perceptions of officers facing a large intoxicated suspect after a dangerous pursuit. The prosecution asked them to see a man being beaten after he had already been brought under control. Outside the courtroom, people waited with the assumption that the video would determine the result. Los Angeles officials knew the verdict could provoke anger, but later investigation found serious failures in emergency preparation. The report prepared by former FBI and CIA Director William Webster concluded that the city and LAPD lacked adequate readiness for major civil disorder, particularly during the period leading up to the verdict. Command arrangements were unclear, resources were not deployed quickly enough, and the department failed to respond effectively as violence spread. The city understood that a dangerous moment was approaching. It did not prepare as if it believed its own warning. On April 29, 1992, the jury returned its decision. 3 officers were acquitted of the charges against them. The jury failed to reach a verdict on one charge against the 4th officer. The news moved quickly through Los Angeles. People gathered outside the courthouse, at police headquarters, in homes, stores, workplaces, and on street corners. Some reacted with disbelief. Others said the result confirmed what they had expected all along. The central problem was not simply that people disliked the verdict. It was that they believed they had seen the crime. The recording had been broadcast nationally. The Christopher Commission had already documented serious problems with excessive force inside the LAPD. Residents had years of personal experiences with aggressive policing. Now a jury had watched the same video and returned acquittals. For many people, the legal system had not merely reached a disputed conclusion. It had denied what their eyes had shown them. The first major gathering formed near Florence and Normandy Avenues in South Central. People entered the intersection, blocked traffic, threw objects, and attacked motorists. Police officers initially appeared in the area but withdrew as the crowd grew and commanders struggled to organise a response. The withdrawal left the intersection without effective control. Motorists drove into a situation they did not understand. Several were pulled from vehicles and beaten. One of them was a white truck driver named Reginald Denny. A television helicopter recorded attackers dragging Denny from his truck, beating him and striking him with a concrete object. The images were broadcast live. Several local residents later entered the intersection to rescue him and drive him to a hospital. The attack became one of the most widely remembered scenes of the unrest. It also demonstrated the danger of allowing television images to stand for an entire population. The attackers were real. So were the black residents who risked themselves to save Denny. A single intersection contained brutality, fear, confusion, and courage within minutes. Elsewhere, another motorist, Fidel Lopez, was dragged from his truck and severely beaten before Reverend Benny Newton intervened and protected him. The violence was not moving according to one racial or political plan. People attacked motorists, looted stores, settled personal disputes, stole goods, set fires, protected neighbours, defended businesses and rescued strangers. Some participants described their actions as anger over the verdict. Others took advantage of the absence of police. Some were intoxicated, some were gang members, some were local residents. Others travelled into affected areas. Calling all of it a protest would ignore the robberies, assaults and killings. Calling all of it meaningless criminality would ignore the political event that triggered it and the history that made the response possible. The LAPD's initial failure allowed the crisis to expand. Officers were concentrated at command posts while calls for assistance multiplied. Units lacked clear instructions. Some commanders attempted to protect police facilities rather than enter rapidly deteriorating areas. Firefighters responding to burning buildings were attacked or prevented from working safely. Businesses burned while owners waited for help that did not arrive. The years of aggressive police presence made the absence especially striking. Residents who had seen hundreds of officers flood the streets during Operation Hammer now watched the department fail to secure major intersections after the verdict. The Hammer had demonstrated the ability to arrest large numbers of people during planned operations. The unrest revealed how poorly the city could respond when events did not follow the plan. Looting and fires spread beyond Florence and Normandy. Commercial streets were stripped. People carried televisions, clothing, food, alcohol, furniture and appliances from stores. Some residents took basic goods from supermarkets in neighbourhoods where stores would soon disappear. Others stole luxury items or destroyed property without any claim of necessity. Fire moved more quickly than political explanations. A store could be emptied in minutes and burning shortly afterward. Flames spread to neighbouring buildings. Smoke covered large sections of the city. Fire departments received more calls than they could manage. The unrest reached Koreatown and commercial districts containing large numbers of Korean-owned businesses. Many Korean merchants called police and received little or no assistance. Some armed themselves with pistols, rifles and shotguns and climbed onto rooftops or stood behind storefronts. Television cameras recorded them preparing to defend businesses that represented years of work and family savings. These images later became simplified into the story of armed Korean merchants fighting black rioters. The full situation included Korean Americans, black residents, Latino residents, white residents, gang members, store owners, workers, customers, police officers, and firefighters moving through the same unstable areas. Korean-owned businesses suffered enormous losses. Studies and later accounts found that thousands of Korean-American businesses or properties were damaged, looted, or destroyed, leaving many owners financially devastated. Korean-American victims later protested at City Hall, arguing that government agencies had failed to protect them and were providing inadequate recovery assistance. Many merchants had insured their businesses poorly or not at all, because coverage in high-risk areas was expensive. Others discovered that policies did not cover the full losses. Savings accumulated over many years disappeared during a few hours. Their anger was directed not only at looters, it was directed at a city that had left them to defend themselves. Latino residents were also deeply involved in the events and heavily affected by them. By 1992, South Central was no longer an exclusively or overwhelmingly black environment in many areas. Immigration from Mexico and Central America had changed the population. Latino families lived in the same neighborhoods, attended the same schools, worked in local businesses, and experienced the same fires and police shutdowns. Some participated in looting, some protected property. Some were killed or injured, some were arrested in large numbers during the restoration of order. The common description of the unrest as a black-white conflict failed to reflect the city that Los Angeles had become. During the first night, Mayor Tom Bradley declared a state of emergency and imposed a curfew. Governor Pete Wilson ordered the California National Guard to mobilize. The Guard's arrival took time because soldiers had to assemble, receive equipment and ammunition, and move into position. Federal troops and Marines were later deployed after President George H.W. Bush invoked federal authority at the request of state and local leaders. Eventually, more than 16,000 law enforcement personnel were mobilized. Nearly 10,000 National Guard troops were sent into the Los Angeles area, with additional federal forces available. For residents, the appearance of soldiers confirmed the language officials had used for years. Los Angeles had called South Central a battlefield. Now military vehicles and armed troops were moving through its streets. The soldiers guarded intersections, shopping centres, fire crews, and damaged buildings. Their presence helped restore order, but it also created scenes rarely associated with an American city. troops carrying rifles outside supermarkets, checkpoints near residential streets, and armoured vehicles moving past burned stores. The unrest lasted several days and spread across a large area rather than remaining confined to one neighbourhood. When it ended, more than 60 people were dead. Thousands had been injured. More than 12,000 people had been arrested, and thousands of fires had been reported. Damage estimates varied, but losses reached hundreds of millions of dollars and were commonly placed near or above $1 billion in contemporary value. More than 1,000 buildings were damaged or destroyed. The deaths did not belong to one category. People were shot, beaten, stabbed, burned or killed in accidents connected to the disorder. Some were participating in crimes, some were defending property, some were bystanders, some died during encounters with police or the National Guard. The label attached to the event has remained disputed. Some call it the Los Angeles riots. Others call it the uprising, rebellion, civil unrest or civil disturbance. Each term emphasizes a different part of what happened. Riot emphasizes uncontrolled violence and criminal destruction. Uprising emphasizes political anger and resistance to injustice. Civil unrest sounds neutral, but can hide the intensity of the suffering. No single term contains every event. The unrest did not begin because crack cocaine made an entire population irrational. It did not begin solely because gangs wanted an opportunity to loot. It did not begin only because 4 officers were acquitted. The verdict was the trigger. The city had supplied the conditions. Years of unemployment and disinvestment had weakened legal opportunity. Segregation had concentrated poverty. Crack had created profitable illegal markets. Guns had increased the cost of every conflict. Gang rivalries had normalized retaliation. Operation Hammer had deepened resentment through mass stops and arrests. The King video had made police violence visible, and the verdict had convinced many residents that visibility did not guarantee accountability. The failure of police leadership after the verdict allowed anger and opportunism to spread into large-scale disorder. None of these conditions excuse the beating of motorists, the killing of innocent people, or the destruction of businesses. Historical explanation is not the same as moral approval. It is possible to recognise that the unrest grew from real injustice, while also recognising that many of its victims had not created that injustice. The Korean shopkeeper, whose store burned, had not decided the King verdict. The truck driver pulled from his vehicle had not designed LAPD policy. The child whose apartment filled with smoke had not built the crack market. The firefighter attacked while trying to save a building had not caused unemployment. Once the city began burning, anger moved beyond its original target. That is what made Los Angeles a tinderbox rather than a planned revolution. A tinderbox contains dry material accumulated over time. The final spark is important, but the spark does not explain why the fire spreads. Another city could experience a controversial verdict and hold demonstrations without suffering 5 days of widespread violence. Los Angeles entered April 1992 carrying too much combustible history. The unrest exposed failures that could no longer be dismissed as neighbourhood problems. It forced national attention onto police accountability, racial inequality, urban poverty, immigration, small business vulnerability, emergency planning, and the consequences of the war on drugs. It also showed that aggressive control and effective protection were not the same thing. The LAPD had spent years proving that it could overwhelm a neighbourhood during planned sweeps. When the city's most predictable crisis arrived, it failed to protect residents, motorists, merchants, and firefighters during the critical first hours. The crack era did not end when the fires went out. Addiction remained. Gangs remained. Prisons held a growing number of people convicted under severe drug laws. Families continued caring for injured relatives and children who had lost parents. Business districts rebuilt slowly, and some never fully recovered. The federal prosecution of the officers involved in the King beating later produced convictions against 2 of them for violating King's civil rights. The other 2 were acquitted. The result brought a measure of legal accountability, but it could not reverse the events of April 1992. Los Angeles changed its police leadership and introduced reforms. Community organizations expanded gang intervention and rebuilding efforts. Gang members from rival neighborhoods participated in truces, including the important Watts Truce that emerged around the period of the unrest. These efforts showed that the future had never belonged only to police, dealers, or politicians. Residents had always been trying to prevent the next shooting, guide the next child, protect the next store, and keep the next conflict from becoming another funeral. That work had been present throughout the entire crisis. It was simply less visible than fire. When people remember South Central Los Angeles in the crack era, they often remember helicopters, gang colours, police raids, burning buildings, and armed men on rooftops. Those images are part of the history. They are not the whole of it. The larger history is about a city that allowed poverty, segregation, unemployment, addiction, violence, and distrust to accumulate until every institution began responding to emergencies rather than preventing them. Crack changed the streets because it made desperation profitable. Guns changed the consequences because they made retaliation immediate. Aggressive policing changed the relationship between residents and the state because protection increasingly arrived in the form of force. The King verdict did not create those conditions. It revealed how little confidence remained that the system would correct them. By the time Los Angeles caught fire on April 29, 1992, the city had already spent years living near the flame.